case you have to leave early or in case some folks couldn't join us, we can do that as well. Okay. All right. Let me get to my PowerPoint. Okay, so a couple of Zoom webinar tips. If you're not in Chrome and you have some functionality issues, please switch over to Chrome. The session is being recorded, as I mentioned. We also have a call-in number for any of you who have audio difficulties. Let us know. We're going to have a bunch of interactive sessions that you'll be typing and chatting in. We're going to do a poll, some breakout rooms, and discuss some case studies. Again, we're going to hold all the major kind of questions and answers until the end. And all of your mics and videos will be muted for attendees. So please use the chat function if something comes up. So in terms of today, I want to welcome you to the Nonprofit Board Governance. This is a Civic Leadership Academy webinar. We are in partnership today with a bunch of great folks, so I want to go through their introductions first, and then we'll get right into our agendas. As I said, we have a pretty rich, I hope, pretty rich content for you today, and you'll have some good takeaways. So let me get to the presenters. Myself, I'm Dr. Alicia Schatteman. I'm the Acting Director for the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies at Northern Illinois University. I've been a professor, an associate professor right now. I started as an assistant professor in 2010, joint faculty member with the Department of Public Administration and the Center. I teach nonprofit management classes, undergraduate and graduate classes. I was an executive director for 4 years before I went back and got my PhD from Rutgers University, finished up there in 2009. You can find me and follow me all over on social media and websites, but most importantly, I'd probably say LinkedIn is the easiest one. You can also follow me on Twitter. My email information is there. And then I started a podcast about a year ago. So if you're interested in things that are going on a local level, both public government as well as nonprofit organizations, it's called All Things Local. So you can check me out there. All right, why don't we go to our next presenter for introductions. Pam.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm Pam Clark Reidenbach. I am the Executive Director and founder of the Northern Illinois Center for Nonprofit Excellence, which is more fondly known as NICNE. My background is I've been the CEO of 3 different nonprofit organizations, a community center, a YWCA, as well as a domestic violence program in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois and a master's degree from the University of Wisconsin. And truly my passion is working with nonprofit organizations. The mission of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence is to promote and grow innovation and excellence in the nonprofit sector. So it's truly my pleasure to be here with you today.
Awesome. And we put Pam's information there if you want to contact her afterwards as well. Julianne.
Good morning. My name is Julianne O'Connell. I'm with the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies at NIU. Before I go on, I did want to tell you guys, it has been raining here for like, I don't know, forever. And my daughter, though, she was working the night shift at a hospital in St. Louis, and the sun did come out there yesterday. So I just wanted to share that there is still sunshine. So I've been working with the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies since it was first developed 10 years ago. This is our 10th anniversary, when I was just a young grad assistant. Before that, I had worked at a large nonprofit trade association in Chicago. So I come from the association side of nonprofits, but then have also worked with a lot of different nonprofits ranging in all the subsectors. So at NNGO is what we call it. At the center, I teach our boards and governance class, also a program development for nonprofits class, and that's my area of doctoral study. I love being with people who are making such a difference in the world. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Julianne. Otto?
Good morning. First of all, thank you for allowing me to be here and to share with this. But briefly, my background is after graduating from Northern Illinois in 1976 with a journalism degree, I became the first paid fundraiser for the Rotary Foundation in Evanston. And that's really what I've done over the past 40 some years with a background also in philanthropy. So it's been fundraising and philanthropy. My last job with Episcopal Charities, which was over the last 18 years, I ended up running their capacity building program. In fact, I suspect a number of you, I know Julie and you've been in some, have participated in some of the trainings that we've done there. But I retired at the end of the year, and really this is what I want to do in retirement, is really to encourage a new generation of nonprofit leaders in a field, in a sector, and in a world that's rapidly changing. Because I know many of you are on the front lines, literally, of doing some really important work, and anything I can do to encourage you, including today, it's very meaningful to me. The best way to stay in touch with me is through my own website, which is whywegive.net. I also have a blog that I do that you're invited to sign up for. But again, I look forward to today.
Thanks, Otto. All right, so we'll go to our first activities. Let me stop sharing for a moment. And I'm going to switch my view here. There we go. Okay, so our first poll to kind of get to know you is, in your current nonprofit, are you a staff member, a board member, a volunteer, or other such as community member or donor? And we'll give you a few minutes to respond to that. And then I'll share the results with you. And I did share the registration list, so all of our presenters know generally your position or what organization you're with, but this will just help everyone on the in the webinar to also get a sense of who's here with us today, because we have around 50 individuals with us. Okay, it looks like 80% of the folks have voted. Okay, so I will end the poll and share the results. So almost split between staff and board members, which is great. And then a number of you, now I realize that board members are also volunteers, so that's also the conundrum. Do I pick volunteer, do I pick board member? Because you're technically both, so thank you. And I'll stop this one, and then I'll go to our second poll. So I also want to make sure, have you ever served as a nonprofit board member? So let me launch that. And I'll wait till around 85% of the folks have voted. And it looks like overwhelmingly, most of you have served in some kind of capacity. So let me, okay, we're at 85%. And I'll share the results of that. So yeah, pretty much 2/3 of everyone on the call has at least served in some nonprofit board capacity. So thank you for that. And then we will go to our third poll, which I'm always interested in. I'm sure Otto is, and other folks that work with nonprofit organizations. We're curious, does your nonprofit organization have a current strategic plan? And I always include the word current because you never know. Yeah, and the results that are coming in are about what I think is out there in the world. So I'll end the polling and share it with you. So just about 60% do have a current strategic plan, which is great. And I think that's probably, this is not a random sample of individuals. These are folks who are coming to this webinar who already have a pretty high interest in their organizations. But this is interesting because in the general nonprofit world, I think it's much lower. So congratulations to all of you who have a current strategic plan. And I'm gonna launch one more poll and then we'll get into our first presentation. So this will also help us as we talk more, as we get into a little bit deeper dive on your organizations. How would you describe your current nonprofit's organizational culture? And I chose 3 of these boxes so you can read through them, but basically is, 1, we're very entrepreneurial, we try new things, we're not failure averse, we make decisions quickly. 2 is kind of middle of the road, we're kind of cautious, might really dig in, think about things a long time, we're challenged to make quicker decisions, and so in this pandemic right now, your organization has probably felt that a lot more. Or we're really risk averse. We have a history of doing the same thing, very predictable. Failure is not discussed, and if it is, it's generally not positive. So we'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. This one is a little more thinking time. We have about 85% of the vote in now, so I will end the polling and share the results. So just about half would consider themselves an entrepreneurial culture. And maybe Otto, you can, in your section, I'm sure this is something that you'll talk about too, is that organizational culture really does influence everything that your boards do. So, okay, I will stop sharing the results now. Thank you for responding, everyone. We appreciate it. And let me go to, I have to now go back to sharing my screen. Awesome. Okay, and Pam is going to kick off our first presentation discussing legal and fiduciary responsibilities. And I'm going to be the tech in the background. So Pam, you can just let me know when you want me to advance slides.
That's great. Thank you, Alicia. I've always wanted my own Vanna White, so appreciate your willingness to do that. You have your gown on, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. High heels, you bet. Or slippers, I don't know.
Oh, good. Well, thank you all for being here today. And I will warn you that if you hear whimpering sounds, it is my dog trying to get into my office. He's very used to my being at home. But let's go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to cover this particular piece, sometimes not as exciting or as conversation around innovation, but it really is foundational information that every board member and staff member should be aware of. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are the 4 basic things that I'll be covering and discussing. Some governing documents, basic roles and responsibilities, fiduciary legal duties of the board. Name the conflict is up there. We're going to play a game at the end of my presentation called Name That Conflict of Interest to have a little fun with the topic. And then talk a little bit about some leadership expectations. Next slide. Okay, so most executive directors know this information, but not sure that all the board members do, but should be aware and ensure that this information is available and that they're aware of the purpose of each one of these pieces. So the Articles of Incorporation, this is a legal document that's filed with the Secretary of State to create nonprofit corporation during the incorporation process. So they include basic information about your nonprofit, the name, the purpose, your registered agent, and the registered address for the organization. It'll include the membership structure of your nonprofit and how to distribute assets upon dissolution. And there are various sources that you can use to get samples on Articles of Incorporation if you are planning to start a new nonprofit. Your bylaws, you should be very familiar with the bylaws, especially as a board member. They should summarize the board's duties to act in good faith and in the best interest of the organization. So they're kind of the operating manual for the nonprofit corporation. They contain information like the term of a board term, the number of board members that you need for quorum, when meetings are held, elections and appointments of officers. And you may want to check and perhaps alter your bylaws if you don't have accommodations for remote or online meetings. which are something that I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have moved to. And then the last piece is our minutes of the board meetings. These do not need to be transcripts of your board meeting, but a record of proceedings and actions that have been taken. So typically, the secretary of the board might record the attendance and proceedings and actions of the meeting, but there may be another person who's appointed or designated to do so. But the meetings, the minutes of the meetings should be retained by the organization permanently. Next slide, please. We go to the next slide, Alicia. Thank you. Thanks. All right, so obviously the executive would know about all the reporting requirements, but again, the board should know about these. And matter of fact, make sure and ask on a regular basis that these reports and forms have been completed and submitted in a timely manner. So we'll go through each one. So first is the 990. The 990 is normally for organizations that have $50,000 or more in gross receipts, and that's required to file an exempt organization information return to the IRS using form, it's called the form 990, or sometimes the short form is a 990 EZ, but it's due, don't you love this government language, the 15th day of the 5th month after the end of the organization's fiscal year, right? What does that mean for most of us who have a fiscal year that ends on June 30? November 15th is the deadline. And so there's also, they call it e-postcard or the Form N, and those are for small nonprofit organizations that have gross receipts of less than $50,000. Then you've got your state annual report, and that's filed annually. It's signed by an authorized officer for the organization with a nominal $10 filing fee. Then you also have your AG 990IL. This is where registered charities are required to file this annual report within 6 months of the end of your calendar or fiscal year, and that's $15 fee again for the Illinois Charity Bureau. Then you have audited financial statements. Audited financial statements are required for nonprofit organizations with gross contributions that exceed $300,000, or if you use a paid fundraiser to raise funds for your organization. Not someone on your staff, but someone external that you're paying to raise funds for you. You also, the Illinois Department of Revenue is if you have employees, employers with quarterly tax returns, your form 941 is something that you need to complete. And then if you own property with the Chief County Assessor's Office, you need to, on an annual basis, attest that your property is being used for a tax exempt purpose. And you need to do that annually. And if you fail to, you have the potential to lose your property tax exemption. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to spend a little time with some of these. These are the basic roles and responsibilities of the board of directors. These come from Board Source, a national resource on effective governance. And it provides guidelines on basic roles and responsibilities of nonprofit boards. So we're going to go through each one of these, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. And I might touch on how these impact you during a pandemic. Although I know that Alicia is going to spend significant time talking about some of the specific issues and impacts because of the pandemic, but it's hard not to talk about these in that context given the situation that we're in right now. But first is determine the mission and the purpose. So often the mission has already been determined by your organization when it was founded, and it should really answer the question, what good for whom, right? Not describing the how of what you do, because the essence of the mission doesn't change, but how you operationalize the mission, it might change. And I always use the example of the YWCA. I was the executive of the YWCA for about 8 years. And the history of the YW, so you look at the mission and the history of the YW, it's always been about empowering women. But in the 40s, the YWCA had a residence facilities for women who were coming to the city to work in the factories while men were at war. Well, that's no longer irrelevant how to deliver the mission, but empowering women is still very relevant today. But how the YW is developing or delivering that mission is very different through their programs and services. So the how should not necessarily be a part of your mission. And then during a pandemic, your mission should really be the litmus test for all that you do. But you might ask, you know, what are we offering that is most vital to our participants? And what is our most direct route to meeting our mission as you really need, as organizations face financial issues, and how you really focus on what is most crucial and directly related to your mission. Items, the second and third item, which is select the chief executive and support and evaluate that chief executive. I put those together because there is no more important time, especially during a crisis, for the board and the executive to be closely aligned. The board should be providing active, steady leadership in partnership with the executive. The third piece ties into the survey results, and to know that 59% of you have a plan. That's very exciting. That is a very critical and important part of the board, especially having that 1,000-foot view or a vision for the organization. That's part of the board's responsibility, is ensuring that there's an effective plan moving forward in the organization. So in this situation, however, in the pandemic, you may need to set your strategic plan aside during the crisis and create a one-year action plan that is flexible and responsive. So much has changed, so much will continue to change. You have to be agile, you need to be flexible. But again, the essence, your mission doesn't change. You'll stay focused on that mission, but perhaps your plan may need to be set aside. But I will say that a crisis sometimes presents challenges, but it also has opportunities, perhaps for change that's necessary, for innovation, and for some creativity. The next role and responsibility is to monitor and strengthen programs and services. Staff have really been hired as experts in program and service delivery, but the board should not micromanage in that area, but ensure that the programs meet mission and are the most direct route to meeting that mission, and that they are demonstrating impact toward meeting mission. Another role and responsibility is to ensure adequate financial resources. It is the board's ultimate responsibility to ensure resources to meet the mission of the organization. Nonprofits might hire or pay a professional fundraiser or grant writer to raise revenue, but it is ultimately a board's responsibility to ensure the resources are available and properly managed in order to meet the mission. Then we talk about, this sort of goes along with that, and is that the board's responsibility to protect the assets and provide financial oversight. Questions that a board might ask now are, what do we do to mitigate loss? How do we recoup lost revenues? What are options for reducing expenses? Or how do we rethink our fundraising model? Next slide. Good. And then we talk about how do we build a competent board? How do we assess performance? Clearly, having a well-rounded, engaged board will provide you with the oversight, kind of the foresight, the insight needed to move the organization forward, and in this case, react to a crisis and prepare for recovery. But a crisis is not a time to assess the board's performance. But when you're on the other side of this, it is a good time to assess how your board did and what needs to be put in place to be prepared for the next one, which we hope never comes, right? Next is ensure legal and ethical integrity. The board should implement policies here and procedures that demonstrate its commitment to high ethical standards. So maybe a code of ethics. Your core values might speak to this. Guiding principles, there are different words for those pieces. And have effective policies for handling employee complaints and procedures for employees to report in confidence, of course, any suspected financial impropriety or misuse of dollars. You'll want to have a conflict of interest policy, an agreement signed by your board of directors annually, and ensure that an ethical pursuit of donations and contributions. Don't ask for donations if you don't need them. Kind of shame on Harvard, right? And don't overpromise on what you can deliver to ensure getting the gift. The important thing there is because you want to maintain a trusted relationship with your donors and the public. The board also acts as the Court of Appeals, a basic role and responsibility of a board. This is where you develop a process for staff concerns to be heard by the board, and especially unable to be resolved by the executive. Staff should go first to the executive, and if cannot be resolved, then go to the board of directors. And then be prepared to seek legal counsel when that's appropriate. And then last is to enhance the organization's public standing. Nonprofits rely on the public's trust to sustain their work. So the board should provide leadership with confidence and calm, especially now, and be open and honest with stakeholders to maintain and enhance the public's trust and your standing in the community. Next slide, please. So I always enjoy putting this slide up, and I think everyone needs to be to understand here that on a board, no one person has more than one vote. No one person has more authority. Votes are made and members must stand by the decisions of the majority. Keep in mind too that the board president is a neutral facilitator. His or her job is to ensure that all members' voices are heard, okay? He or she does not vote except to break a tie. So I hope, can people raise their hand? How many are aware that the board's role, the board president's role, is to be a neutral facilitator?
You want me to do a poll, Pam? I can do a poll.
Can you do a poll?
I think
People can
so.
raise hands too, right? Can they push and raise a hand on that? Not so much.
Not so much.
Okay, well, we don't need to do a poll, but something to think about.
Okay.
This is one thing when we're doing board training that people are always saying, oh, we didn't know that. Our board member is always a part of conversation. Our board member is always voting. But the idea is for that board president to truly be that neutral facilitator, making sure that everyone's voice is heard as part of the conversation, and only vote when you need to break a tie. Okay. Next piece. So I think it's interesting to talk about the expectations of a board. Some boards have agreements for members to sign so that they're aware of what the expectations are. Not a bad idea, right? So it's very clear and upfront. My experience is that these clear expectations save time and heartache later down the road. So in general, these are some of the expectations of nonprofit board members. You may have others that you might not, and some that may not apply to you, but let's just go through them, all right? So first and foremost, a board member must support the mission of the organization, all right? This is not a training piece. I don't know that you can teach passion for a mission. So make sure that individuals joining the board support the mission and that the organization's public policy positions. Some of you might not have public policy positions, but you want to make sure that if you do, that the board members' personal positions align with those. I can tell you a perfect example here. When I was part of the YWCA, at that time did have public policy positions. They still do. And one of those public policy positions was pro-choice. And so we had to make it very clear to anyone that was joining our board that that was a public policy position of the board and that they may be asked to speak on that should they become a board member. No surprises later on when the issue came up, or if the issue came up, but it was an opportunity for us to make sure that the people that we put on our board, their positions aligned with the positions of the organization. Next is to make sure that board members know their expectations and that they're attending meetings on a regular basis. Know what those expectations are. Some organizations have that you need to attend 75% of the board meetings. And the important thing there is to enforce that. Some people, we sort of give a little bit of leeway, but inequitable treatment of board members can become a public trust issue. So use your bylaws to be clear and equitable in your treatment of each and every one of your members. Then also support the organization you govern by attending the events. Show support of the staff and the volunteers who spent a lot of time preparing and organizing that event. And also read your board materials in preparation of the meeting. There's nothing worse than asking a question that is obvious within your packet. People know that you haven't prepared. Then most boards also require members to participate on at least one committee. You should know that in advance before joining the board, what that expectation is in terms of time, not only on the board, but in your committee work. But find the committee that interests you. Or sometimes people choose committees that might help stretch their skills or grow their experience. So for those of you that are not being counters, being on the finance committee might be an opportunity for you to grow your skills. And then make an annual contribution to the organization and to all of the campaigns. 100% board participation sends a really strong message to the community. And how can you really expect others to give to a campaign when those board members, those closest to the organization, are not giving? And really, it doesn't matter how much you give, but that you give within your means and that you're participating. So, and sometimes donors will actually ask the question, is 100% of your board participated in this campaign before they'll consider making a gift? Then also attend retreats and stay in touch and in tune with the organization and and by doing that, it really builds rapport with the other members of the board. And if you've offered to make a call or head an ad hoc group or take on a responsibility, follow through with those promises. And then do your homework and be knowledgeable about the issues of the organization. The other piece is speak as one voice and know who is the spokesperson for the organization. Don't take calls from the press and give your opinion on an issue. Know who will speak on behalf of that issue and support those individuals who are chosen spokespeople for the organization. Really importantly is to support the executive or your CEO, truly respecting the chain of command. There's no more important time for the board and the staff to be aligned than during a crisis. You might hear me say that more than once today. And be available and prepared to discuss critical issues when it's necessary. And then last is to uphold confidentiality of discussions, especially within the board. No meetings outside of the meetings, no lingering parking lot conversations, right? Respect the organization you represent and the people that the organization employs and serves by being professional and upholding that confidentiality. Next slide, please. So this is a representation of a 20th century governance model, where time is spent reporting on historical information, looking behind you at activities and information you cannot change. This type of governance, in my opinion, disrespects the intellect of the group and assumes that they will not read their board information and will not be prepared for the meetings. These types of meetings find attendance falling off and members disengaged. So if you're wondering why it's hard to find a quorum for your board meetings, it could be, next slide please, that your agenda looks like this. The same agenda each and every meeting. I mean, it sounds even boring saying that, right? Same agenda each and every meeting. So a typical board meeting might look something like this. Rhetorical, but how many of you have a similar agenda? No guilt intended, right? It's very common to have an agenda that looks like this, but I'm gonna suggest another option that might improve attendance, might improve engagement, and create some forward momentum. So next slide, please. So try what's called 21st century governance, where the time with your board is spent looking forward toward the vision you created within your mission, within your strategic plan, right? Rather than looking behind you at things that you cannot change. So this agenda might look like the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so you might call the meeting to order and reading the mission. By reading the mission, it keeps you focused on why people are at the meeting, right? You might create a consent agenda. Those non-controversial or routine items that don't necessarily need any action or deep discussion. If people read their packet, they have the information. And that allows you to jump into discussing your strategic action plan. I call them strategic action plans, by the way, because I think strategic plan gets a bad rap for being stale on a shelf and collecting dust. So making your plan action-oriented by building a report mechanism into your board agenda. One that does assume that you have a plan, but it encourages you to have a plan so that you can always be talking about things that are in front of you rather than those things that are behind you. So stay focused on your plan and use that timeline within your plan to help you determine what things need to be discussed and planned and acted on as a board that are part of that plan. Then another item is a strategic discussion items. These might be challenging questions where you engage all the board and using the good brains and the reason that people are on the board to help you look forward. And Otto is going to talk to you about generative thinking. Oop, I'm not sure why that's doing that. There we go. But Otto will talk to you a little bit about generative thinking, and this will be a great opportunity to have really key questions that are part of your board, so the board is truly engaged at each and every one of their meetings. And then you talk about unfinished business, not old business, right? You don't want to rehash old business. So you talk about issues that had no closure, maybe at a previous meeting, and those are considered unfinished business. And then anything new, and then adjourn the meeting. So this is just an example of how you can have an agenda for your board that's forward-looking, action-oriented, keeps people engaged, and keeps your organization moving forward. Now we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the legal duties of the board. So next slide, please. Okay. So there are 3 legal duties: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each one of those pieces. So next slide, please. Okay. So the duty of care, and it's all filled with legalese, of course it is, because they are legal duties. But really the essence of this is where you exercise reasonable care when making a decision as a good steward of the organization. What that means is that you read your packets, that you're asking questions, that you're using sound judgment when making decisions, and that your decisions are made independently and in the best interest of the organization. You know, a lot of times people will say, I joined a board of directors and it really took me about 6 months to feel as though I could speak up, right? And 6 months into your term, all that wisdom, all of those questions, all those things that you are wondering are probably things other people are wondering. So really ask questions use that independent judgment. Don't be swayed or influenced by the strong voices of others, but really ask questions. There are truly no dumb questions to be asked, and be fully engaged as part of your duty of care for the organization. Next slide, please. Next is the duty of loyalty. Really, this is where you give your undivided allegiance when making decisions affecting the organization. You cast aside your personal and professional interests and place the interests of the nonprofit ahead of those. Now that's easier said than done, right? And we'll get into that when we talk a little bit about conflicts of interest, because conflicts of interest fall under the duty of loyalty for the organization. So, and when we're talking about cast aside personal professional interests are also maybe interests of a spouse or significant other. So if your spouse is a banker and you're going to make a loan with that bank, you know, there's some issues there that could be conflicts of interest that you need to consider. You also want to make sure that as part of your duty of loyalty that you're respecting confidentiality. We talked a little bit about that a few minutes ago. But that you're not disclosing the affairs of the organization, okay? About the people that are served, or as well as the organization in general in the community. And especially in a way that might lead to a loss to the organization. And then you have a duty to act in good faith. And that usually requires you to act honestly and faithful to the organization and your obligations as a board member. So like I said, at the end of my presentation, we're going to play a fun game with some silly scenarios, but really sort of hits to this point on conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. And the third duty, the duty of obedience, is tied somewhat to the duty of loyalty, but it requires the board to be faithful to the organization's mission and not act in a way that's inconsistent with the goals of the organization. So what does that mean? Really what that means is that you comply with all federal, state, and local laws, that you have knowledge of and ensure that all required taxes are paid. Remember back when I first started, we talked about all of the forms and all of the obligations that need to be made as it related to government documents. So part of the board's responsibility is making sure that all of those are complete and that the tax exempt status is not put at risk by not filing all of those forms. And then truly to remain faithful to the organization's vision and its mission. And that's why that front work is so important in the people that you choose to be on your board, that they have passion for the work and a commitment to the mission. So next slide, please. So anyone that knows me knows that I like to have fun, and so talking about what might you do to build a better board, I thought this cartoon sort of said it all. I'm at a board meeting and I'm bored. I have to share a story with you about when I was this CEO of the YWCA, and my daughter, who's now 27 years old, but she was in daycare at the time, and I would bring her to meetings. And I would advise everyone to bring a child to a meeting with them, mainly because when the kids are starting to get antsy about an hour and 15 minutes into the meeting, you know that adults are feeling the same way, right? That you're ready to move on. But I went to pick up my daughter Hannah from daycare one day, and Miss Joelle says to me, "Pam, you will never believe what Hannah was doing today at daycare." I'm like, oh boy, what was she doing? And she said she had all the other children in the daycare sitting down, and she said, "Now we're going to play YWCA board meeting." And I thought, oh my, what might that be? And she said she had gone over to the kids' plastic workbench and grabbed a hammer and was basically sitting and pounding it on the table saying, "Order, order, order." And I thought, I guess we need to change the board meeting at the YWCA. So anyway, I just tell that as a fun story. But again, making sure that your board meetings are engaging and fun and interesting for those board members, so they want to continue to remain involved and contribute to those meetings. So next slide, please. So we had collected a little bit of information from nonprofit CEOs on what they wish they could change about their boards. And I think this information is really kind of important, and it'd be interesting to hear from you what you think about what you wish you could change about your boards. But many CEOs, and this was in rank order, wish that their board members would be more involved in fundraising. No surprise, right? But that board members would truly open their circles of influence and be willing to be actively engaged in fundraising. They also said that they wish that the board would become more educated, that they would attend trainings, and that they would do some self-assessments. Some people were very happy with their boards and didn't have any suggestions, or maybe feared that if they did, their board is certainly the person responsible for hiring and firing decisions, right? And then attendance, preparation, and participation. Again, people wanted their board members to read their packets, to come prepared. Some people had concerns about the board composition or the size. I don't know about Alicia or Otto or others, but this is a question I get from people all the time. What's the perfect size of a board, right? And I don't know that there is an answer to that perfect size. I think average size is 12 to 15, I think last I heard. But really depends on what it is that you need from your board, because some boards are very grassroots, very hands-on. Some are just governing boards. So I don't know that there is a dream size of a board, but certainly composition and size was something that board CEOs wish they could change. Some wish that their board was more engaged in governance and strategic issues, not micromanaging, too much diving into the day-to-day. There's a fun exercise that we would do with board members using like a 3-foot dowel rod, where we have them balance that dowel rod on their finger, looking at their finger, and you can't balance it doing that. But if you look at the tie end of the stick, it's a much easier to balance. And we would always say that this might be a politically correct way to tell your board members that they're looking at the wrong end of the stick if they're micromanaging. So try that with your board sometime. One of the other things they wish they could change was the schedule, the agenda, and the time for their meetings. Board committees. You don't want to have committees to schedule meetings just to meet, but really to optimize the use of committees for those things that you really need to get done. I've heard many organizations going to more ad hoc work rather than actual structured committees, but really make sure that your committees are meaningful. And then, of course, having a relationship with the CEO, having a strong, trusted relationship is something that CEOs wish they could change, as well as a deeper, more respected reputation of the board chair and the members of the board as well. So those are the things that CEOs wish that they could change about their boards. Next slide, please. And I share this with you too. This is some information from the Harvard Business Review about markers of great boards. Certainly having a climate of trust and candor, having civil discourse can be very healthy. A real healthy, good discussion can certainly strengthen your board and be a marker of a strong board. Your willingness to share information, being open and honest is also crucial. Creating a culture that invites multiple perspectives and a diversity of perspectives is also important. And to make sure that the organization is listening to the voice of the consumer and co-creating programs with your customer base. You also want to have a commitment to the assessment of your board. So looking how individual board members are performing, as well as the performance of the group as a whole. There are many resources, both simple and complex, on ways that you can assess board performance. if you need information, any one of the panelists today can share with you some great tools for board assessment. Next slide, please. And these are just a few additional things that I think make for good boards. Those board members that are focused on the big picture, the 1,000-foot level, the vision for the organization, the strategy for the organization. I think also, having a discussion, whether you're in a pandemic or not, on what is the most expedited route to meeting mission. Some human service organizations, in some cases, are working to work their way out of business, right? And so what are we doing, and what is the most expedient route, expedited route to meeting that mission? Vision for the future, clearly we've talked about that a lot, but a topic that doesn't get discussed near enough is having an intentional conversation about succession. Succession of the ED as well as the board. And we've also talked about partnership with the executive. Now this ends my piece and my portion of the presentation. But I really wanted to say that most organizations are deeply concerned, and boards deeply concerned about their organization's financial situation. Know that giving is resilient. There will be a downturn, but it will bounce back. It always has, right? Nonprofits have really risen in this to this crisis, especially human-serving organizations that are serving the most vulnerable people. Communities have leaned on nonprofits to assist the most vulnerable among us during this time. My hope is that the relevance and the importance of the sector will be more strongly felt. And as a result of the crisis, that people will feel more connected to each other and more connected to the community as a result of the great work of nonprofit organizations. So thank you for the opportunity to share this information, and I think it's Otto's turn to share his wisdom. Thank you.
So I actually have two questions for you, Pam, before you go ahead and mute yourself that came in on the chat, and we have a little bit of time before we do the activity, Name the Conflict.
Okay.
So a question came in about conflict of interest policies. So were you suggesting that boards have a conflict of interest policy, and then should that policy be signed individually by board members annually, or when they first come on the board? How have you seen that handled?
So you have an obligation to have your board sign a conflict of interest statement every year. So you have a policy related to conflict of interest that accompanies this form that the board should sign on an annual basis.
Okay. And secondly, you mentioned that if the board chair is a neutral facilitator, do they still count for quorum when you are taking the vote?
Yes, I do believe that the board president is part of the quorum for the board meeting, but they do not vote only except to break a tie. And it's really important when you think about Robert rules, and I think they're usually the parliamentary authority for most nonprofit organizations. So the reason there is to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And if you have a position and you are stating that position as the president, it's difficult to hear the other voices and manage the voices of the group.
And last question, you mentioned that the auto requirements, so $300,000 or above, or if there's a paid fundraiser, does that include a contracted grant writer, for example? Would they be considered a paid fundraiser that would trigger an audit?
Well, that's a really good question. And it's something that I would have to research. I don't know, Alicia, if you're aware of the answer to that question.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing. So
yeah, I don't think so. I don't think a grant writer is, but I'm going to do some homework on that, and I can get back to you on that answer.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to go to, this is going to take a little bit of tech here. So we're going to do an activity, and what we're going to do is we're going to put participants into virtual breakout rooms. And we have some, our hosts, our presenters today will be hosts in the breakout rooms, and they're going to discuss two scenarios. So your facilitator will be one of the presenters. And then the facilitator is going to go through those scenarios and ask individuals to comment on the conflict and discuss ways to resolve or prevent the conflict. So this kind of highlights that no one is assuming there won't be conflict. There will always be conflicts of interest in organizations. It's not about saying that there's never going to be conflict of interest, because there will. So we want you to discuss the scenarios, and then we'll leave a little bit of time to chat, and then everybody will move back in. So as we do this little technology maneuver, just stay with me. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute here, and I am going to put folks in breakout rooms. And it's not going to be anything fancy here. We're going to just do alphabetical as we move into rooms. I want to make sure that I have at least one of the facilitators in the room. All right. Looks like I'm going to have around 8 or so in each room. And Pam, okay. All right, I think everybody's in a room now. I'm going to give you about, let's see, it's 10. I think we're planning to do this for about 15 minutes. So let me get you the timer. And then once I set the timer, what'll happen is you'll get like a 60-second warning, so the last minute. So right now it's 10 o'clock exactly. At 10:15, you'll get a warning saying 60 seconds left. And at the end of the countdown, then you'll automatically be moved back into the main room. So cross your fingers, all the technology works. And I'll be in breakout room number 4. So just give me a second and I'll meet the participants in there. Okay, everybody who's in the main room, if you are not in a breakout room, let me know. If you want to turn on your audio for a second, I think everybody should be in a room. So let me see. Okay. Awesome. I take it everybody can hear me because my mic is off, so hopefully you guys can hear me. In this breakout room, we were going to chit chat about a couple of scenarios. So I wanted to see if I could also type them into the chat function so that you guys could see that maybe. I don't know if I can do it within the chat. Oh, Zoom group chat. Yep, I think I can. All right. So I'm in here. So the first one we're going to talk about, let's see. Everyone. see if this works. Okay. First one we're going to talk about, Jeff Jeffers is a board member of a homeless shelter and staff member of a local nonprofit organization. He learns at the board meeting about a great earned income venture being considered by the homeless shelter. Jeff shares the information with his organization and they pursue the venture. So he sits on the homeless shelter board, but he's also a staff member of a different nonprofit organization. So he has some inside knowledge of the organization. Have you guys ever seen that happen where you have someone who is in multiple kind of networks? Oh, I have somebody who's not assigned. Let me see. I just have to assign one more person. Let's see. Okay. I think we should be good. Okay. So do you guys have any thoughts of that kind of conflict where they might be members of two different organizations, one is a staff member, one is a board member, and that there could be information shared across? If anybody wants to chat in, they could do that. Or you could turn on your audio. Yep, I can hear you. Go ahead, Ray.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I'll just jump in right off
great.
and say I'm the member of several nonprofit boards, and each of them have their own procedures and levels of formality. One that I'm on, we sign a conflict of interest statement every year, and it's rigorously enforced. And what you're describing just simply wouldn't occur. It would be discouraged and beyond discouraged for that particular board. So we're very, very careful that there can be no actual conflicts of interest or even an appearance of a conflict of interest. And we talk about that beyond signing the statement. We talk about that regularly as a board for instances that might come up within the organization. Another board that I'm on, similarly, we sign a statement every year, but we don't have that same level of discourse. It's just assumed that people wouldn't do what you're describing. And I've, over the course of 8 or 10 years that I've been on the second board, I've just never seen anything like that come up. So I guess what I'm saying in summary is that every board that I participated in would discourage or strongly discourage, prohibit the kind of action that you've described here.
So what happened? So let's pretend that this thing did happen. If you were a board member or the board president at the time, and you found this out, what kind of actions do you think that your nonprofit boards would take if they found this out?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know the one board, because I've actually been a part of it, would talk to the, if you will, the offending board member and either tell them that we have to work around this. In other words, their organization simply can't bid on the work, or we would invite them to leave the board. Being a board member is a privilege, and there are expectations that go along with that privilege. And if they aren't living up to that standard, they simply can't be on the board.
Thank you.
It's not necessarily an easy conversation to have, but as long as you understand the rules going in, it's a necessary conversation. You can't look past that.
Thank you. Paula, you had a comment in here. You had one board member that used the organization to support another organization, and board members didn't seem to catch on what was happening. This is before the board and everyone had signed the conflict of interest policies. So yeah, I think what we have to recognize is, as much as we don't want these things to happen, is if it does happen, what's the remediation? And some board members might unknowingly do things that they just didn't know was against conflicts of interest, because conflict of interest tend to be written in very broad terms. And so we could not come up with all of the various scenarios that could result in a conflict. So there's all this interpretation, and who kind of is monitoring that as they go. Other thoughts from other folks in the room about how you've dealt with a similar or some kind of conflict of interest that relates to this kind of having information on two organizations, and where that either got people into trouble or where they were able to kind of remediate that as a result of something that they did. So Neural, you added a comment. Aren't the key questions conflict against the mission of the organizations or not? and if there's a personal gain by proposing members, any potential recusal of that member. So yes, I mean, I think there's multiple layers here when you talk about conflict of interest. Is there something that's going against the mission, and then the personal gain aspect? So there's certainly bars when you think of conflicts. So is it just a moral, ethical kind of thing, or is there a legal thing, or is there a personal gain thing? And then there's also the perception issue, right? I mean, trying to figure out what kind of, how would this look to the public if this got out? And I think that's a higher standard in some cases, particularly in smaller communities where you have reputation, and that has a significant value for nonprofit organizations, right? Because we have donors and community partners and all of that, so we don't want to damage the reputation. So what does this look like from the outside, not knowing all the nuances? And sometimes, you know, your auditors can even help you with this. If you've pursued getting a financial audit, they will often highlight these things too. And I'll share kind of one little story, and it's small, but we had a board member, I don't know if she was present at the time, but we had a board member who would often, we were a very small organization, she would often run to Costco for us and pick up, say, paper products, paper towels, napkins, whatever we happened to need, because it was cheaper there. She would go get it while she was getting other stuff. She would give us the receipt, and we would issue her a reimbursement, you know. And that was kind of a practice for a while that we were doing. And on the surface, you're like, well, that doesn't seem terrible. I mean, she's going to Costco anyway. We're paying her exactly what we paid for the goods. We have a receipt. Everything's been documented. I mean, we think we're pretty good. So the auditors came, and they're like, why do we see these, you know, kind of regular monthly reimbursements to a board member of whatever it was, whether it was $100 or $200, whatever it happened to be? And so I explained the situation, and the auditors, they were very clear that there's nothing illegal about any of this activity. What they were more concerned about is just that practice of reimbursing board members on a regular basis. And they said, well, is she getting any personal gain as a result of this? I'm like, well, no, we're not paying her for any other expenses or anything like that. And they said, well, you know, she's using, at the time, Costco only took American Express or something weird. She was getting points. So she was earning points in her personal credit card because of these purchases at Costco. Which to me is like very small, but again, it's appearances, and there was a personal gain or perception of personal gain. So we stopped the practice. So was that something that we were going, like both the board member and myself never thought that that could be a potential conflict of interest, but the auditors actually pointed that one out to us, and so we stopped it. So there's those kinds of things that tend to pop up. So Matt, you also had a comment. An organization I worked for hired the organization I'm on the board of for services. Okay. So I avoided all discussions around those services for both organizations. So you abstained or recused yourself during the debates, during the discussions, during the resolutions, whatever it happened to be. And that's a very normal way to handle certain things. That if I've had nonprofit organizations where the husband is the board president and the wife is the CEO, or she's a program director. And then that can create all kinds of conflicts, looking at salary and performance evaluations and things like that. I've been with organizations where they rent space that one of the board members owns, and it's a competitive process to secure you know, the administrative offices, and so they had to recuse themselves during that bid process. Everything had to be closed, names were not disclosed, I mean, all that kind of stuff. So I think we just have to live with, there are going to be conflicts. We can't think of every potential conflict that's out there, but we have to think through how are we going to manage that conflict then. So our second scenario is, before we come back, is Henry's on the board at a daycare center and a board member of a church. I'll put it into the chat function too. Both organizations are negotiating on a lease of office space. Henry informs the church of the last offer for the lease space, and it turns out that the daycare center actually underbids. So as a result of that information, that creates a conflict. Again, it comes back to one of those financial situations. So from a board member's perspective, if you were sitting on this board, say you're sitting on the daycare center's board, and you've received this information, and the daycare center's now, you know, they underbid. I guess the church underbid the daycare center because of now they know what the bids are. So has that ever happened, or something close to it, especially on these kind of financial relationships where two organizations are maybe competing for something, and then one organization actually comes out ahead. Have you had any experience in any of that kind of thing? Any of our folks that are in the group discussion here? Other than if you were just recuse yourself if you were part of that discussion. You know, and this brings up a good point, and thinking about conflicts of interest, one of those things are how do you bid for services, all services. So whether that's you're doing rentals or you're actually bidding for legal services or accounting services, things like that. I think how you handle that, and if you're doing it on a regular basis, like accounting services should be done every couple of years. Do you always go with the same people because they give you a good deal? Those could be potential conflicts of interest, depending on who's involved and how that process works. So kind of to summarize is not to say that conflicts won't happen, because they will, and they do every day, and there's no way you could think of all the various ways, but how do you build a culture so that those things are disclosed quickly, and then there's a process kind of going through. So I know that we're going to come back in 1 minute to the main room because I'm watching the clock. So Michael just notes, I've not seen the situation, but I would ask Henry to resign. Yeah, based on personal relationships. Yes. And it brings you back, if you've been asked to be a board president, boy, those are hard conversations sometimes that you need to have. Sometimes people knowingly get into these conflicts, and other times it's unknowingly. And then you have to have those difficult conversations with them. Yeah, I agree. All right, we're down to the last 30 seconds. Both examples of breach of confidentiality, yes, as well as conflict of interest. So sharing information outside of board meetings, definitely breach of confidentiality, absolutely. So I think we're at 15 seconds. This is so bizarre watching the clock the entire time here, but I'm going to send a message to everybody. Okay, I'm going to close the room. Now we'll see if we can get everybody back in. Oh, looks like people are coming back in. Good. 29 seconds. Here we go. Great. Wonderful. Thank you for sticking with us with all the technology moving people out. It looks like we're about half of the folks are back. Awesome. We'll give them 1 more minute. I think we're at 42, so it looks like everybody is back. Perfect. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that little session. I am now going to turn it over to Otto, who's going to share his slides and his presentation with you. So Otto, let me know if you need any assistance, but you should be able to now share your screen.
Okay, very good. Now, is that working?
Works great. Yep.
Okay. At least in mine, let's see if I can move that over. Oh, okay, good. I can move that over a little bit. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. And when I was given or asked to participate, the question was, what is it that makes nonprofit boards exceptional? The ones that really stand out. And a couple of things that I'd like to say before I get into the meat of this is probably what I'm going to talk about all boards are probably doing today, because we're in crisis mode. They're all trying to figure out, what does this mean to us? Where are we going? How are we going to survive? What will we look out, or what will we look like when we come out of this?
And these are all the right questions. What makes an exceptional board truly exceptional is that they've had a culture of doing this even in times of prosperity, in times of peace, in times of health, always asking those questions. And Pam referred to this in her opening comments. This is the 21st century board, the board that's always looking ahead and not so concerned with where we've come from. The other thing that I would like to say is I know that a lot of you are on the front line right now of this COVID response and really being challenged. And I think the work that you're doing today, just if you're a board member or an executive director, is exceptional. And I would like to thank you for that. I've been on the front lines of different things over the years, and I know it's often a thankless job. It's a tough job, but anyway, thank you for what you do. So what I'm going to cover over the next half hour is the work of exceptional nonprofit boards. And the three things I'm going to be talking about is that, first of all, they create a culture of generative thinking or generative work. The emphasis is that there's a culture of doing this, and it's not a one-time thing. The second thing is once they have gone through this generative process, how do they execute that? Well, they exercise adaptive leadership, and we're going to talk about that. And then the last thing is that exceptional nonprofit boards really do work that matters. And the question is, matters to whom? And again, Pam touched on some of that about multiple perspectives, but that really is essential to exceptional boards, is that they know work that really is making a difference, and they know their constituents, and they know that it matters to them. We're going to try and get these slides to advance.
Yeah, sometimes I had to hit it twice. I don't know. Normally I didn't, but just so you know.
Yep. Well, I'm glad we did our practice session because that's exactly what happened. So what I'm going to do is talk about this in a problem-solving mode. And there's three modes of board governance. And the first one is fiduciary, and Pam had talked about this. And with that, when we're in a problem-solving mode, its problems are meant to be spotted. And the question is, what's wrong? So we look at financial reports, we hear program reports, and really boards are in this mode of, okay, everything seems fine, or no, something's not, or something's out of whack. So that's really the first mode of fiduciary. And then the second one in this problem-solving mode is strategic, where problems are meant to be solved. Okay, so I've gone through the fiduciary and we see that our cash flow is falling behind where it should be. What can we do about it? And this is what boards do. And again, Pam had said an interesting thing too about, well, fiduciary is not as exciting as some other work, which I agree. Boards think, well, we listen to reports, but I loved her solution to that, which is building, questions into the agenda. But what I want to point out is the fiduciary work, and somewhat strategic, but really fiduciary, and I use this example all the time. It is so critically important. It's like that little circuit breaker that's probably down in your house's circuit or your panel right now. And you can go to the store and buy one of these for $5. But that circuit breaker, if it fails, can burn down the $1 million house. And that's how fiduciary work is. It often is there, it's done quietly, it's sometimes neglected, but it often is the difference between a healthy organization or the whole house burning down. I'm just going to jump in and make an endorsement. I don't know if anyone saw on HBO their HBO film called Bad Education, but it was, I think the preview or the premiere was Sunday night. I would really recommend watching that because it shows what happens when a nonprofit board, in this case it was a school board, neglects the fiduciary responsibility. So anyway, it's critically important. But then the third one after fiduciary strategic is generative. And in a problem-solving mode, here problems are meant to be framed. And the question is, what's the right question? What's the right question that we as a board need to be asking? And to get into generative work, this is not really the same as knowledge, whereas fiduciary is, well, what do I need to know about our budget? What do I need to know about programs? This is really about, it's a collective process about what knowledge, about what data and information, what it means, and what it means to the organization, what it means to where we want to go. And really, generative thinking is what, it tells the board what's important. It tells them how to act. And it tells them really what meaningful success is. So we're going to get into some generative questions here. But this idea that boards don't spend enough time doing this. What they generally like to do is they go into the first two modes of what's wrong, they identify it, then they come up with the plan. And they never take that third step of, and it's the old ready, fire, aim mode. And generative really would be the aim. So it's ready, aim, and then we're ready to act. So the first is that these organizations or healthy, extraordinary boards create a culture of generative work. And what this means, and what I like to say, the culture begins with a spirit of inquiry, not a spirit of advocacy. And a spirit of advocacy, you'll know it when you see it at a board meeting where people come and they go to the fiduciary work, they know the problem, and right away they want to advocate a solution. You know, that we know what needs to happen, we know something we've done in the past that works. Whereas a spirit of inquiry really is when I'm presented with a problem, or whether it's cash flow or a program thing or a decision that needs to be made, the key question is, well, what if? What if we tried something different? And a spirit of inquiry is really exploring the unknown. It's anticipating the unknown, what might be, what could be, and it requires taking a step back. And I know that's a hindrance, especially in times of crisis, that sometimes we feel like we need to solve a problem right away. So we only stop at the fiduciary and then maybe the planning mode, and then we go on to the other business of the day. And the problem is we leave a lot on the table. We leave a lot of what might be or possibility if we do that. So again, the key question is, what if? And what makes generative work so important is that this is really what keeps the organization relevant. And again, I like Pam's wording of 20th century versus 21st century. We are in a whole new, brave new world today. And what worked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, really isn't relevant anymore. And I would say, dare to say that what worked for your organization in January probably isn't relevant today. That's how fast the world is changing. Another way to think of generative work is that this really is the R&D for the nonprofit world. This is where we do our research and development by asking the right questions. But again, it's got to happen in times of prosperity and peace and health, and don't just do this in times of crisis. When I was with my last organization, Episcopal Charities, it was in the mid, like 2004, 2005, and our investments, and we're a grant maker that relied on investment income. Our investments were going up so quickly that things were starting to accumulate. Well, somebody on the board had the wherewithal to say, is this really who we want to be? Because we have organizations that are in need, are we really about accumulating more and more money? And they started with the question of, what if we use this to look into other programs, other models? And out of that came a very significant new program that today is almost the essence of that organization. So again, generative work is, you want to create a culture of doing this, and we're going to talk about how, where it pervades the organization, not only in times of prosperity, but at every meeting and every communication, where a spirit of inquiry, of questioning is honored and encouraged. But again, really the goal of this too is keeping the organization relevant and being successful. But the question is, to whom and for whom, and how are they going to measure success? In our little breakout room, we got into that a little bit with our conflict of interest thing, and Pam talked about these multiple perspectives. That is critically important to generative work. And if you take anything from this, please take this. The answers to what we've been talking about are not within the boardroom. They are outside the organization. And this is an ideal opportunity for your board to get outside of the boardroom, outside of the organization, and to start answering these questions. Something that we may have raised at a board meeting and somebody said, what if? Take those questions out to your constituents. Take them out to the general community, knowing who you're responsible to. And what I like to, what I like about this for boards is that you're really sending them out with the right questions. Remember, that's generative work, to ask questions. They're not going out to talk about themselves or the organization, other than we're thinking about this, we're contemplating this, this was an idea that was raised. What do you think about this? What's the downside? How would this impact you? What are issues that you're dealing with? What I love about this, and Pam, I think you had talked about this too, about levels of expertise between board and staff. When I started 40 years ago, there was a huge imbalance in that we needed boards in the nonprofit world because they brought in expertise that we generally didn't have on the staff. Today, that is almost reversed to where almost every organization I go into now has highly experienced, highly educated staff members who really have become the experts in their field. Well, this kind of work of sending board members out into the community to garner this information makes them experts when they come back to the boardroom and they can report, this is what I heard, this is what I've been hearing, this is what I think now, and it really levels the playing field. And once you get to do this, you're going to see how this opens up conversation when everyone is back in the boardroom doing generative work. And what I'd like to say too is that these should be informed opinions that are being shared. And this goes opposed to the spirit of advocacy. Well, this is how I've thought, this is how I'll always think, and I'll fight this to the end. This is not about that. This is about what we are hearing collectively. And then the next question, we're going to talk about this, which is adaptive leadership, is what do we do about this? One thing I want to add too, before I move to the next slide, is that really this is up to the executive director to nurture this culture. And the reason is not because they're any smarter or any more gifted, but again, you've got turnover on boards. You have board chairs who are leaving after a year or maybe two, board members leaving after 4, 5, 6 years. Whereas the staff, we hope, and I know this is changing too, there's more continuity. And so I really like to see the executive director being the sort of the sheriff of culture. So once we go through the generative process, like I said, people go through the fiduciary work, and then they do the strategic work where they want to solve the problem right away. And this happens when we race to solve a problem from a technical perspective. And again, there's, well, what I want to say about this is, first of all, adaptive leadership, which is what we're going to talk about, it really puts generative thinking into motion. It's a way to make sure where multiple perspectives are taken into consideration and acted on in ways that honor your constituents. Adaptive leadership is a way of making sure the organization changes and adapts in meaningful ways. When I ask organizations I work with how adaptive you are, we're very adaptive and open to change. And change itself is not always the solution, it's how you change. Because you can alienate people just as easily, and we're going to talk about this in a second, if you change, than if you would just stay the same, because change is hard. So adaptive leadership is a way to change in meaningful ways where your constituents feel honored and you bring them along with the change. When I teach this in my other programs, probably what I've seen is the single biggest failure of leadership is when we have an adaptive challenge and we treat it as a technical problem. Because again, we leave so much on the table. And this is really, I think, getting at the root of this is that this is what we think leadership has become today, is problem solving. Is we want leaders to come in and solve problems for us. We want to hire the executive director and say, well, our fundraising isn't going well, fix it. We want to take the cash flow problem and look at the treasurer and say, give us some idea. But really, what this is, adaptive leadership, when we look at adaptive challenges, it's a chance for everybody to work together and to come up with something new, something that one person can't really think of on their own. And it really starts with knowing the difference between technical problems and adaptive challenges. And I've used many examples, and right now I couldn't think of a better one than stopping the spread of the COVID virus. And we've seen, that social distancing, stores have been closing, people are wearing masks, there's laws, there's regulations, and these are all technical responses. And the question is, are they working? Yes, for the most part. Are they working across the board? No. There's a vocal, what I would say is a minority of people who are, we want nothing to do with this. In fact, not only do we want anything to do with this, we're angry. And we're going to fight you on this. We're going, here in Illinois at least, we have lawmakers who are going to court fighting it. We have people showing up in Michigan at the steps of the legislature, the governor's house, saying, nope, we don't want this. So, what's happening here is that, this is a straightforward thing. We've got a virus that's highly virulent, it's spreading. So here's the solution. And we got all these things, but it's not working, at least not for everybody. So there's something else going on. And if you look at this as an adaptive challenge, and we're going to get into this in just a second, one of the things I like is I think Andrew Cuomo understood this. And I don't know if you saw his press conference where he read the letter from the Kansas farmer who shared with his letter an unused face mask that he wanted someone in New York on the front line to use, even though he and his wife are in their 70s and his wife had multiple health conditions where she needed that. There was something that that accomplished, I suspect, with some people, that all the technical responses didn't. Technical problems really, they live over on the left side of your brain where all the logic takes place. Adaptive challenges, they take place over here on the right side where more emotions are done, feelings are done. And adaptive leadership recognizes that there are multiple perspectives even on the issues that we're dealing with. And that's how we tackle them to get everyone to come along in meaningful ways. So, generative leadership, we talked about, it's about asking the right questions. And okay, we've done that. And we think we've come up with some solutions, multiple solutions, that's fine. And now we're ready to act on it. But the first thing that I want to say about exercising adaptive leadership is that it's risky. And really all leadership, if it's true leadership and not problem solving, is risky. And the reason is, and I give credit to this to Marty Linsky, he's a Harvard professor who really did the hard work on adaptive leadership, is that it has to do with the distribution of loss. And we need to acknowledge this as we're leading our organizations through the process of change, is what does the distribution of loss mean to those who really are owners of our organization? And by owners, I mean anybody who has a vested interest in the welfare of your organization. What does loss mean to them? Let's go back to our COVID response. What was going on with these people going to court or marching to the governor's doorsteps or to the legislator, shutting down traffic? There was this sense of loss. I'm losing my freedom. I'm losing the God-given right I have to go to my barber or to shop, and I'm going to fight for that. And we need to be aware of that as we're starting to explore the ideas that we've come up through, in this case, generative thinking, is what's going on with my constituents? What are they, what kind of loss are they going to be experiencing? What does it mean to them? And until we deal with that, and this might be your staff too, and this is going to be on your board. They're going to be dealing with loss. Until we deal with that, these are going to be landmines that are waiting for us to step on. And the problem with dealing with loss, when you deal with stuff, again, going back to COVID-19, like my freedom, my liberty, is, again, these are living over on the right side of our brain where it's emotion and feeling. Well, guess what? The right side of your brain really is not where language sits either. And people can't articulate why I got so emotional when you raised that at the board meeting. Or when I read that in your newsletter, I just got so angry. Because leadership, again, is risky because we're walking in these two areas, left brain, right brain, technical, adaptive, or emotional. But change is always, it's difficult for people, and we need to know this ahead of time. And this is where the first two parts of board work really fail when it comes to meaningful change, is that this is where adaptive leadership and adaptive challenges address it. Is, okay, I want to understand the full nature of my constituents. So how do you do that? Well, guess what? You get board members back out in the community. So again, the first time we're harvesting ideas. Now we've got board members out again testing those ideas. If it was up to me and I'm in the legislature or if I'm the governor, I would want to sit with these people. I would call them in and say, okay, I get it, you're upset. What's going on? What I like about this too is the root of getting board members out into the community really requires some training, but we're not looking for experts here. We're looking for people who are good at listening. And again, I love Pam's, the duties of board member, people who know that, they keep the board sacrosanct, and they don't sell out the organization. But third, they're good storytellers. I want to hear, I want to tell my story, but most importantly, I want to hear their story. When people, if I would sit with somebody and they're talking about, I'm losing my liberty. Well, tell me about that. What is that? Well, I can't, I wanted to go take my wife and get her hair done. Well, why is that important to you? It's the ability to ask questions. And this gets back to the spirit of inquiry, is the power of questions can't be overestimated. And again, this goes back to a working relationship too, between the executive director and the board, is creating this culture where questions are honored, where we create this safe space for questions. And what I'll say though is that we know the difference between good questions and bad questions. And when I'm saying we honor questions, we honor good questions, informed questions, and not the hand grenades that are tossed from the bushes, well, what I heard is, why aren't we doing this? Like, that's not what this is about. So again, adaptive leadership, it's risky because it's about the distribution of loss. And the question that we take out into the community is, we're thinking about this idea of imposing these things to stop the virus. What is it we don't know about that? Or we're thinking of this new program. We're thinking of coming into the community and doing this. What is it we don't know about this? Two things happen. The first thing is you expose the landmines. The second thing is you get ideas that nobody in the boardroom thought of. And it's sort of like, you know what? We didn't even think of that. That's a great idea. And then you go back and as a board, you all start working on that together. The last thing is, or the third thing is, what do boards, exceptional boards do, is they do work that matters. And what I love is this quote, and I've used it often. You've probably heard it if you've been in some of my trainings, from Catherine Tyler Scott. The work of the nonprofit board is to preserve the organization for a time they will never see and people they will never meet. Exceptional boards have that 21st, even 22nd century perspective, that we are stewards of the organization today to get us through some very hard times, but in a way that will get us into the future so that we thrive. And so we can look back with integrity and be proud of what we've done. So it's this idea of creating a culture of doing work that matters, though, is the how of how we do this work or how we build this culture. And this is also, the role of values is knowing your values. And, people often ask, well, we know our values and they're up on the wall behind our receptionist or it's in our mission statement. But really, the best way to know your organization's values is to look back in your organization's history at times of crisis, other times, and how did they respond? What did they do? Did they pull back? Did they become defensive? Did they hunker down? Or did they become almost irrationally generous, really stepping out in faith to do some things? And this is how history is going to look back on your organization today and see, how did you get through this? What steps were taken to make sure that this organization not only entered into this future, but entered in a way that preserved its values, that acted on its values, that honored its mission, and really, most of all, honored its constituents. And this is what exceptional leaders do, and I believe this is the last slide, is that they lead from their heart. And just what we're talking about, they know their values. So, they lead from individuals of integrity, but they also lead the organization from their heart. And this only happens through self-reflection. I'm always disgusted when I work with organizations and I ask them about when was the last time your board went through a self-evaluation. Most of the boards I work with they don't even do this on an annual basis. That's just inexcusable. My point is self-evaluation, especially for individuals, but for boards, should be an ongoing process and not even once a year. And this was actually integrated into those earlier board agendas that Pam shared, is that you can see in there that there's a self-evaluation going on as we're asking some of these questions, some of these agenda items. But there should be time at every board meeting, every committee meeting, every staff meeting for self-reflection. How are we acting? How did we do it the last time we got together? Did we honor our values? What did we hear from our constituents? Wow, I'd never even thought to check with them. Well, we should be in continual contact with them. And the age of social media makes that very possible to stay in touch. But really, exceptional leaders, they know what cares to them, and they don't sell out on that. They know what cares to their organization. They don't sell out the organization. But most importantly, they know what cares, or what their constituents care about. And they really, and this is the duty of care and loyalty, they bring that loyalty back to the boardroom, and they are a voice for those people in the boardroom. And that really is what we're in business of, is being a voice, being a resource, being a champion for those folks that we serve. The other thing, the second thing exceptional leaders do is they have the right people on their bus, from Jim Collins, from good to great. And this really is the essence, again, of what Pam said about building a competent board, is most of the boards I deal with, again, going back to, they address board recruitment almost as a technical challenge. Is, okay, we're coming up on your annual meeting, we have 4 slots to fill, we need somebody on finance, we need 2 people good on fundraising, we need a minority, and we need a woman. Okay, well, let's go find them. That's all well and good to fill these slots for people as we're in the nominating stage and recruiting stage. But the most important thing is not what we want people to do, but what do we want them to believe? And this is what I like to see happen in the recruiting process, and certainly how I like to run orientation sessions is, what do I want these people to believe as they come on the board? Do they share our passion? Do they share our theory of change? Do they fit within our culture? Because you might be able to check off every box up to that point, but if there's not a culture fit, if they're not marching in step with where that board is going, because again, remember, leadership is risky, and you're going to have to fight some fights. You want everyone to be marching in the same direction. And again, there can be disagreement on the board as you get to certain decisions. But when you come out of that boardroom and you're starting to implement and lead, you've got to be 100% together. So again, you want to make sure that that board member is the right person for that bus, the right person for that culture. They believe what you believe. They believe where you're going. They're willing to fight the same fight. They're showing up with a spirit of inquiry and not advocacy. And then the last thing is they lead with questions, not answers. Exceptional leaders, you want to be careful that this is sort of a lone ranger too, that I've come on, I've got the answers, and too many times now boards will defer to the executive director. They will defer to the staff who now is becoming more expert in their roles. And there's a danger in that. We all want to be asking questions. You know, the difference is that, you know, managers manage problems. Leaders lead people to where we've never been before. We're going somewhere new. And they do that by asking questions. Leaders walk alongside people. They work with people. They learn with people. And questions are so important. I work with a lot of faith-based organizations in my work. In fact, Episcopal Charities was my last role. And somebody shared with me once, and something really stuck with me. It was a handout about the 100 questions that Jesus asked. And that really took me back. You know, we think of, you know, Jesus always talking and teaching and telling. But just think, the 100 questions that he asked, this is what exceptional leaders do. We are always asking questions. We're always pushing the envelope. Always, you know, what if? What might be? Well, what if we did that? And listening to, you know, different populations and what they, well, really, the key question, what matters most to them? And until we have the answer to that, you know, we really don't, we really can't lead. We really shouldn't be leading. So that pretty much wraps up. And what I want to, you know, close with is that the thing that's missing today in board work, and this is being, Pam alluded to it earlier, and this is being borne out in study after study, is meaningful engagement. Is we're showing up, we don't have a voice, we're listening to the same reports. But when you engage board members this way, really get them out into the community, coming back with a sense of expertise, and then collectively working to create meaningful change for everybody, all of a sudden you've got a board that's on fire, and all of a sudden you're the executive director trying to rein people in instead of pushing the 2-ton boulder up the hill. But really, this is what nonprofit boards, and really staff, donors, volunteers, this is what we're looking for today, is to be part of something bigger than ourselves, a cause bigger than ourselves. And this really is the opportunity to do that. And again, it's the eyes of history are going to be looking back on us to see how we come out of this. And I hope this has been a help to guide each of you to come out of this in ways that you're going to be judged thumbs up. You did good.
Thank you, Otto, so much. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions, but I am going to save those till the end because I think that they're going to relate to some of our other discussions as we do wrap up. So we're now going to move into, let's see, we have a case study and another short discussion. I'm going to cut down a little bit in the breakout rooms for discussion time so that we have enough time on the end for Q&A. So Otto, if you can stop sharing your screen, I'll share my slides for a second. I might be able to stop it too on my end if you want. There we go. Let's see. All right. So now you should be seeing my slides, I believe. I've been trying to watch on my side, just watch the chat. So if there's something that comes up in between, just go ahead and chat it in. But I will call on Julianne now to guide us through a short case. We're going to go into breakout rooms for a little bit, and then I'll come back and do a presentation, and then we'll have Q&A. So Julianne?
Excellent, thank you. So here's the thing that we know is that we can take in all of this amazing information. And for you guys, you probably have, you know, some notes and thinking like, how am I going to do this? But until we can apply it to an actual situation, it's really difficult. And so that's where case studies come in, which is great. And we use these in our classroom a lot. For our students who don't have a ton of experience, a case study is the thing that kind of builds the framework for them to apply what they're learning in class. But I think it works the same way for us and for our boards. So most of you, I'm sure, well, it was interesting. Many of you have active strategic plans now that are current. And some of you have strategic plans that maybe are not so current. And when you did those strategic plans, there's a really good chance that you guys used the SWOT method to be considering what was happening in your organization. Not a bad method, but we've kind of moved forward from that. And maybe some of you have heard of the SOAR method, and we're going to go through that, although I did build in just a little bit of a amendment to that, just based on what we have going on in our life right now. So this comes from the thin book of SOAR, which is building strengths-based strategies for our organizations. So we start out with our strengths, and you might want to just jot some notes on this, because when we move into the breakout sessions, you're going to apply some of these things and what you learned from Pam and Otto's talks to some case studies. So in strengths, what we're looking at is like, what can we build on? Really, what are we already good at? And what makes us unique in our marketplace, in our community? And then how do we continue to provide kind of world-class service to our stakeholders, to our clients? So we're looking at our strengths. Now, like I said, I amended this a little and added in challenges. I think challenges is our chance to look at specifically what's happening in the environment right now. It especially makes sense when we're in the middle of a crisis, but I think there are always things that are impacting our organization that it makes sense to look at just from the broader environment. But the SOAR method goes on to say that the next thing we look at is our opportunities. And those are like, what are the things our stakeholders are asking for? And it's so interesting with so many of the organizations that I work with, we're not always thinking about what the stakeholder is looking for, what they need. We think that on the board specifically, like we know what our mission is and we're just moving forward on our mission. But these opportunities, they really nudge us to go out and, as Otto talked about, kind of in a spirit of inquiry, like, what can we do for you? What if we did something different here? How can we reframe some challenges and see them as opportunities? And how can we really use all the different kinds of opportunities that are actually provided to us? We kind of flip our thinking, and these opportunities give a time for us to think in a new way. Aspirations, what do we care deeply about? What does our organization, what is the passion of our organization? And if we look at our values, our core values, and our mission, how are we moving that forward? Sometimes I've been working with boards, and I don't know if in your organization you've ever asked your board members to kind of come up with their like 3-minute elevator pitch. And sometimes our board members can actually, they know the mission decently, but wow, to really live that passion and to be able to say, you know, with genuine, with a genuineness, what the aspirations are, what they care deeply about, why the organization is doing what it's doing. We sometimes fail in that area. So for aspirations, we look at our strengths, we look at our opportunities, and then we are looking to see, like, down the road, how can we be better? Again, back to that spirit of inquiry. What if we did things a little differently? What if? And then we're looking at results. So how do we know we're succeeding at the end? How are we measuring this? Maybe what are some of the indications that might pop up that we could see that we were either on track or not on track? And in this, sometimes we look to see what resources are we going to need to move forward. Sometimes our results show us that, boy, our result could have been a little better if we had done this. So this is definitely a spirit of evaluation, both self-evaluation, but also for the organization in general. So we're going to go ahead and break into small groups, and you'll see that each of you will have case studies, and depending on how much time we have, Alicia, will
Yeah, I'm just checking on the clock. You'll probably have about 7 minutes, so not a
Yep.
whole long time.
Yep, so we'll just go into one case study. And what I'm going to ask you guys to do, I made them very short, so you can read through it. But what I'd like you to do is kind of go through SCORE. But I want you to think about it from the executive director and staff side, but then also I want you to look at it from a board member, the board side, and kind of see how do we look at these case studies and apply what we've learned a little earlier, and see how can we apply these to real life situations.
Great. So each of our presenters will be in a breakout room. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So all the presenters, you have the cases. We don't need to go through them. Do you think online, Julianne?
No. If Otto and Pam have those, what I'm going to do is I've just highlighted mine from the Word document, and I'm going to paste it into the chat once we get into the room. That might work for you guys too.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and put everybody into a breakout room. I'm going to separate it into, let's see. I probably will be the same ones we had before. We had Otto in one, we had Julianne in one, we had Pam in one. So I think, well, you're going to use the same breakout rooms as last time. A couple people have dropped off because they had to go to 11 o'clock meetings, but roughly it'll be the same group as last time. So I'm going to open up those groups. I'm going to close them, let's see, in 7 minutes. And you'll get a 60-second warning to come on back.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, here we go. Okay, breakout room number 4. I have a couple people who I've just got to assign some breakout rooms to, so just give me 1 second. Breakout room number 1. Okay, I think everybody now is in a breakout room. Awesome. Okay, so we have 3 different case studies to talk about, and I'll just, we have, let's see, I'll put it into the chat function because I'm open to talking about any of them really. Let me copy one. This is about a community orchestra. Let me get to everyone. So I'll read it through, but I also posted it there. So this community orchestra has only 1 part-time paid staff person. They've been around for about 20 years. They rely really on volunteers. It's what they term as a working board. They have a president who's been around a really long time, 15 years. So the community orchestra has been a mainstay of the local arts community. They have professional, semi-professional, and recreational musicians to try out for the award-winning group. They rent out space, so they don't have their own space, but they rent out one of 3 local auditoriums for concerts. And they have some other expenses like sheet music, promotion, part-time staff members, etc. So they charge nominal amounts to attend all 6 concerts, which have allowed all members of the community to really enjoy the music. Majority of funding comes from those ticket sales, although they do have some individual donors and a couple of small grants. Recent events have made it really impossible to hold large person events, and this is arts community has particularly been hard hit in this pandemic. But members would like to continue providing music to the community somehow. So if we go through SOAR, can you identify, folks that are in my breakout room, what do you think are the key strengths right away that kind of pop out when you hear about this particular community orchestra organization, this nonprofit? Can anyone give me like 1 or 2 strengths? Long, rich history. Yeah, perfect. 20 years in the community. Yep, they probably have high recognition. Probably solid reputation. Yep. Anything else come to mind? Community connections, for sure. Lots of ways to engage professional, semi-professional. Really, there's a place for all different types of musicians. That's great. What do you think are some key challenges that they're facing right now in terms of the pandemic that we're in, but also thinking about, you know, how they come out of this? What is the most significant challenge to them right now? Loss of ticket revenue. Yeah, without the ability to conduct an event safely, they're going to be really hampered. So I think the key question really comes around some opportunities. They're looking to how do they still earn some revenue and reach the community through music? How do they still do that? What are the opportunities then for them to do that? How can we think creatively about opportunities for this particular organization? Yes, definitely a loss of community bonding. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen a lot of music events online. I've watched several now world music events that have gone virtual. And those have been really interesting on social media and otherwise. I have seen some arts organizations offer online lessons. I haven't seen it done yet. One of my kids takes voice lessons, and we're thinking about doing that in May with some of her instructors to see how that could work. So that's definitely an opportunity. What about their aspirations? What do you think this organization is thinking about when it comes to their aspirations relative to their values? What are they really aspiring to do? Beyond solving like this problem of we can't meet, we can't get people together, we can't have ticket sales. They might be aspiring to stay operational, sure. They might be aspiring to returning to what used to be. Sure. What about bigger? What do you think is their bigger aspiration? Yeah, I mean, connecting music to their local community, providing community, that sense of community building, but also the camaraderie, de-stressing, especially I mean, I think we've turned to the arts in this session a lot. When we think about all of us are binging on Netflix or watching old movies, arts really bring us together. So I think that's definitely something that they're thinking about is how do we provide to their audience? How do they reach out to different communities, maybe that they haven't before? How many people don't go to arts, you know, any kind of arts programming? There are definitely segments of society that have not participated. And maybe it's financial. Maybe people don't feel like it's accessible to them for financial reasons. Maybe it's just not a place that they feel comfortable. Absolutely. Maybe to think about how can we work with other arts groups? If all these arts groups are going through the same thing, maybe that's a way that they could think about is how can we partner with those other arts organizations, even outside of the region, because we're thinking about virtual, right? So what are other community orchestras doing around the country or even around the world that they could partner with and really expose their local community potentially to different kinds of orchestras around the world? Identifying what a broader audience might want in concert formats, different musical styles, absolutely. Culturally, remaining relevant in new ways to their community. Maybe it's not going to be the same orchestra coming out of this. And what does that mean when they think about that? So finally, in SOAR, it's about results. How do we know, how are we going to kind of measure and how are we going to think about ways that we can serve others, what results we're going to look at? So some of you mentioned participation rates, and we're getting down to like the last 30 seconds. Some of you mentioned participation rates is one thing. Maybe the types and offerings that you have, viewership, subscriptions, yes, Ray, absolutely. Donations potentially as they go forward, different ways that they're going to meet their audiences virtually. So I apologize that this was a little short, but I think you had some great ideas. So we're going to go back to the main room in about 5 seconds. You're going to be invited to join back. Thank you, everybody, for participating in the chat room. Thank you so much. So some of you are coming back now. Should be close to getting everybody back from the breakout rooms. I hope you had some great short discussions, I know. 7 minutes goes by. pretty quickly. And we're happy to share afterwards. We can share all 3 case studies. If you only could talk about one, we'll share all 3 case studies just for discussion purposes. So we'll wait till everybody is back. We're at 34, 35. I think everybody should be back. So Julianne, did you want to say anything? You want me to go through my presentation and we'll kind of hold Q&A then till the end? Are you good with that? Okay. You're on mute, but it's okay. I got your. Awesome.
Okay. So I know that was quick, you guys. What we talked about in my small breakout was, I hope you'll consider using case studies with your own boards. These short ones especially are good you can send them out with your board packet and ask your board members to read through that. And even if you just take 10 minutes as a group, kind of going through SCORE and applying it to a case study, as Otto talked about building a generative culture of your board, working through these kinds of issues when you're not in crisis can really prepare you for when crisis pops up. So we don't learn these things really well on the fly sometimes. So to be able to do that on a fairly regular basis with your board, I think can help everybody just feel more comfortable when things pop up.
Yeah, so someone just chatted about the case studies. We're going to send them out with the files as well, so you can just have these 3, and they're useful just for discussion purposes. So we'll send that out at the end. All right, so I am going to do the next little part, and then we'll have Q&A. So let me share my screen again. Back to the technology stuff. All right, awesome. Can you guys see it's in presentation mode, I think. Julianne, can you see that? You can just nod if you, yep, you're good. Okay, awesome. Oopsie. Okay, cool. All right. So I just wanted to briefly chat about, I mean, all of us have alluded to it, and none of us can ignore it, the COVID-19 pandemic and the issues around that. So this, the first part is kind of what's the research that we know when it comes to the pandemic. And Forefront, really, they sent out a survey very early in mid-March, I guess, asking about the pandemic. And so if you want to take a look at their research, I put the link on here and you can go check it out, the full results. And I think we learned a couple of things in there. I pulled out some of how this could differentiate by county, although there's not much differentiation. We did pull out some individual counties. If you want a PDF of this smaller report, just email me and I'm happy to get that for you. I'll make that available. But a couple of highlights. So this is, again, using the same survey data from Forefront. Really early on, we knew that there was going to be an impact right away. We knew that there was going to be disruptions right away. And there's not a lot of variance across from all of Illinois to the individual counties, although there's some. And again, you have to look at, if you look on the far left-hand side, you'll see Illinois and the number of counties and then the number of responses. So DeKalb looks like there's a little bit more variance, but there were fewer responses. So in terms of research, we just have to take into account they might not have had as many as the other counties as well. Expected impact, again, it's gone, likely this has continued to elevate, that a lot of organizations, they expect to see much higher impact as we go forward. Types of things, and we've already started to see this, and I'll talk about a few cases. Certainly cancellation of programs and events happen very quickly. Disruption of services to clients, disruption of their supplies that they're able to provide. Increasing and staffing, volunteer absences, that's certainly hitting right now. Increased demand for services, and that really has, especially around food distribution, has really ramped up. And everybody's going to experience some kind of budgetary implications as this continues. The other question that I think was interesting that Forefront asked, and in an academic institution, we're always asking, are there roles for virtual volunteers? Everybody's a little nervous to volunteer even with protective gear on. So are there organizations that are considering it? And this is one of those things I think that Otto alluded to and that Julianne touched on in cases is that an aspiration? Is there a way that we can engage communities that are typically not engaged in our work to allow for virtual volunteers, and what could they do? What could that look like? You know, the majority of nonprofits who responded to the survey said that they are not in a place to actually offer volunteer experiences virtually. So that could be something that people could think about. Serve Illinois Commission on Volunteers and Community Service has a great website, and they talk a lot about volunteering and virtual volunteer opportunities throughout the state. So if you're a nonprofit and you have those opportunities, you can go in and add that to their database. Or if, on the other side, if you're looking for volunteer opportunities, they also have been a centralized place to get that information. When I speak a lot about nonprofit sustainability and how these nonprofits can get through these things, I often talk about this kind of double bottom line idea, and certainly financial. That's the biggest hit right now, is on the budgetary side. Are they managing resources efficiently? But we also have to be conscious of this program effectiveness side, this mission side. And sometimes they battle it out for finances on both of those sides. Program people are always saying, I need more money to do this, and the financial people saying, I don't have the resources, we can't do those things. So how do you balance those things? One of the ways, and this is kind of the pyramid that Otto alluded to, and then Otto had in his comment, and then Pam mentioned, is knowing your financial numbers. Organizations that know this before this crisis hit are going to be in a much better place, and donors will be much more aware of your financial situation because you've been committed to transparency and accountability. So Pam talked about doing your 990s, making sure that you have all of those, but I suggest don't just file them, make sure that they actually are available on your website. And I always say 5 years, you can put all of them up there. It's really not limited to space now on websites. What I really dislike is an organization that says, for a copy of our 990, please email so-and-so, or there's a link to GuideStar. I think that's just irresponsible for organizations to do that, to make them go to a third party and log in and create those things when it's just a PDF file. So why not make them available? It lends a kind of a suspicion to organizations that are trying to create barriers in order to get that information. Annual reports, kind of same thing, making sure that your annual reports are up to date. You have multi-years annual reports, ideally, and you present your financial picture as easily and as visually as possible. So I always try to promote looking at annual reports, not just as marketing pieces, but as true disclosure documents beyond the 990s, because not a lot of people want to go read those 990s, other than maybe researchers and all of you who read other organizations' 990s. But for the general public, it's like reading somebody's tax returns. So you can use your annual report really for disclosure documents. Thinking about your key numbers, I always look at 5 key ones: are net income, revenue versus expenses. And you can put this on 2 sheets of paper, because I've done this visually for folks in workshops. 2 pieces of paper with graphs, you can get all these key numbers in there. Fund balances, just assets versus liabilities. Leverage, how much debt do you have? What's your revenue mix? And right now we're really seeing in this pandemic, before we used to say make sure your revenue is diversified because of government particularly, or whatever. Revenue mix doesn't help or hurt you, I don't think, in this pandemic, but it's a good idea to know what that looks like. And then just liquidity. This is the big one coming out of this particular pandemic, is how liquid are you? So take your annual expenses. You can do this a bunch of ways, but take your annual expenses, divide it by 365 days. Take your cash available, divide it by daily expenses, and you kind of know how much cash you have on hand, right? We suggest a minimum of 90 days, so 3 months, and ideally 6 months. And I'll show you some research that says not a lot of organizations can even meet that minimum standard. Sorry, now I'm stuck. This way. Oh, there we go. So my research, I looked at a couple of questions. Do we punish nonprofits who accumulate surplus funds? And we actually know this takes place because sometimes foundations, not on record or anything, or funding agencies, government agencies and otherwise, they will say, well, they have too much cash on hand. They're hoarding too much cash. And that's a very values-based statement. There is no such thing, right? So somebody came up with some criteria of, is 9 months too much? Is 12 months too much? Is 6 months too much? Those are funding decisions that they're having. They won't often tell you what that is. And who defines how much is enough? Is that a board decision or these funding agencies? So when we think about some research, we know that there's kind of this paradox. On one hand, organizations should be spending everything on direct pursuit of their mission. And on the other hand, we want them to have a financial buffer so they don't go into insolvency within 30 days. This is that kind of paradox. Urban Institute, and if you haven't looked at Urban Institute in a while, they have a number of resources. But they really say your operating reserve is an indication that you're being well managed. So having that commitment to some kind of savings in a cash position is actually a really positive thing. And other researchers have said it actually supports sustainability when you have a little bit of a buffer, just like individuals, right? It's an organizational thing. What's called fiscal leanness. This is, again, are you accumulating too much or are you accumulating the right amount? So in good economic times, you should be accumulating more so that you can probably plan to draw that down in more unfortunate economic periods. So that should be fluctuating up and down with kind of targets. So that's called fiscal slack. So you have some freedom to adjust your fiscal behavior into the changing economic environment. No one could necessarily have predicted the pandemic, but there are going to be cycles of economic ups and economic downs. We know that, we've experienced it. We need to have nonprofit organizations that can adjust to that. And yet, nonprofit managers are often pressured to spend rather than accumulate surplus revenues, particularly from a donor side. They want those dollars going out to the community right now and not waiting for a time when they actually need it. There's been some more work done on financial vulnerability, and we know, again, that this accruing of surplus increases sustainability. But accruing of surpluses don't just happen. They require board leadership to do it. Whether you're budgeting for surplus, which I would argue is a good thing, or you're designated certain funds to your cash reserves, or you're designating certain gifts like bequests to your cash reserves, however you want to do it, looking at your policies. But surpluses are not just going to happen. They need to be planned for and thought about. I looked at Illinois during 2012 to 2015, and at that point, less than half of nonprofits in Illinois, about half of nonprofits in Illinois had less than 3 months of cash on hand. That means they're going to be hitting it right now. And I put up that this is day 40 of our shelter in place, which means if you have 30 to 60 days of cash, this is the month you're going to run out of money. This is the month where you're going to have to figure out, how are we going to sustain ourselves? Are we going to have to go into debt? Are we going to have to take on loans? Are we going to have to pivot and do that gala a different way, whatever the case is? Through my research, I know that human service organizations tend to have lower odds of having at least 3 months of operating cash. So types of nonprofits are also more at risk. And metropolitan areas tend to have lower odds of having 3 months cash reserves on hand. So there's some variation in the types of nonprofits as well as where you happen to be located. So what do boards have to do with this? They have lots of information around how they can get engaged. They're absolutely responsible for that budgetary control. And coming up with reasonable projections on revenue. They will turn to staff, but ultimately it's their decision when it creates that budget. The fiscal policies of boards, which are going to be emphasized over this next little while, is really around their assessment of risk and restraint. What are we willing to take a chance on and what are we not? And how are we going to get engaged in fundraising? And fundraising, and for those of you who are in fundraising, you don't need me to tell you this. I know there are fundraisers on our webinar. It's not one person's job, it's everybody's job. We teach our students that I don't care if you're going to get a job in fundraising, if you're in a nonprofit, you have to know how it works. You have to understand where the revenues come in. As an employee, who's paying for everything? Where are we getting that money from? So it doesn't belong just to one person. And that developing that culture of philanthropy is really important in the organization, and understanding that your organization needs to be very donor-centric. Building relationships, much like Otto talked about, doing that generative work, I think, is so important to do that. Otto touched on strategy and how that works, how we get into our core purposes. So what is that core mission and how does that change? What are the things that we should be thinking about right now as we are in the pandemic and hopefully coming out of it? Have the needs of those we serve changed over this past couple of months? Are the means of delivery still possible? It's disrupting all of our processes and our chain of delivery. Has that changed? Is there a better way that we're spending resources? I know in certain board meetings, I'm sure there's conversations. I never thought we could have a virtual board meeting and still be effective. I never thought that this would actually help our meetings be run more efficiently. It's amazing how much technical skill we've gained and how the technology has really supported in ways we just couldn't have imagined. So when you think about all those opportunities, thinking about Julianne's system of opportunities, what aspects of our new way of thinking do we want to keep? Maybe there's some great things that we've actually come up with around virtual working. Do all of our employees need to be back on site? How effective has it been to have some employees off site? What's ending and how can we help it to lead well? So some forms of delivery are less relevant now, and how are we going to phase those out? And what's being disruptive and how can we harness that potential? So engaging stakeholders, how do we get those involved? How do we engage them in conversations kind of going forward? So it's already here, right? I mean, we're at day 40. We have a modified order extended through May 30th, and then, you know, we don't know. That'll be 70 days that we will have been in shelter in place. There are definitely difficult decisions ahead, looking at stopping and starting programs, thinking about your structures and financial models, possibly looking at mergers and acquisitions or closures. I would say looking at the data, looking at the last state budget crisis, we actually had very few closures. What tended to happen is a lot of debt, a lot of pain to employees around furloughs and layoffs. And the programming did take a hit, but the programming was kind of like on life support and got through. We'll see what this pandemic brings because the cliff happened a lot quicker. So what has been the response so far? And many of you are on that webinar. Certainly event cancellations, closing and adapting service delivery. And a big one, which I think is still going to affect us for a really long time, regardless of the ending to this pandemic, is around loss of volunteers and our changing needs for volunteers, both virtual, but how do we retain the volunteers that we have or think we have? What is the ability of people then to go back into those regular normal volunteer positions where they're going to be maybe in spaces that they're not comfortable with, where social distancing is hard, working with conditions where they don't feel physically safe. So volunteers for the next year, that's going to be definitely a challenge. So we've seen interruption, we've seen disruption. What we're waiting for now is, will we also see innovation? Lots of interruption and disruption. If you have a retail part of your mission, like Goodwill and Habitat and Salvation Army, those things had to close down right away. And all of those are also related to their individual missions, not just that they're huge revenue sources, but they're also program and outreach for workforce development and workforce training. We've seen arts, and if you did one of the case studies on the arts, so the arts scene face-to-face stopped virtually overnight. That's going to be extended for probably a very long time, looking at large gatherings. We have seen some interesting things happen around disruption. So in our area, if you've seen Hesed House moving to a hotel, I never would have thought of 200 homeless individuals moving into a hotel accommodation, which the state has supported, which the local sheriff's department has supported, their board supported, and this happened within days as their first case that they got at Hesed House. We've also seen organizations partner with for-profit and government agencies, which they were doing before, but really in novel ways. So Safe Passage is a domestic violence shelter in DeKalb. They're promoting their services in grocery stores, at bank marquees. I mean, all kinds of what I would say non-traditional places. And then the community gardens in DeKalb, they had a grow mobile before this whole thing started, but now it's their primary way to get food distribution out into the community. So lots of really interesting things happening around new partnerships. We've seen, these world music events happen. We've seen volunteers volunteering at home making masks, delivering those to organizations, to seniors' homes, to our frontline staff. And then we've seen partnerships in the for-profit world, particularly around Feeding America and other food pantries. YSB this coming weekend is doing a mental health drive-through in DeKalb. They're handing out kits for mental health. We know that there are going to be long-lasting mental health effects from adults to children to frontline staff. And we're going to see suicide rates move up. We're going to have kids coming back with some trauma, you name it. So mental health organizations are really trying to get in the forefront of a lot of that. We have a lot of arts events that are coming out virtually, as I mentioned. And then we've seen these large funder responses, which has just been phenomenal to see, both from the state all the way down to family foundations and community foundations. Really interesting how groups of funders have really come together very quickly to get out direct response grants. And here are just some regional responses. And Pam, if we have time, she can talk about what's going on in the Rockford area with the 815 area. But everyone from Chicago all the way into many counties across. We have online giving, this was Giving DeKalb. Give DeKalb County was set up before it was in place, so that'll be May 7th. But then we've seen a pivot to Giving Tuesday, which would normally take place in November. They will now have a second day coming up next week, Giving Tuesday now. And Giving DuPage launched theirs as well. So these online giving days, which we thought were kind of a supplement to many organizations, are really now going to take the place of a lot of spring fundraising events for these organizations. So if you're not participating in any of the online giving days, I would encourage you to try to do that over the next little while. So leadership that we've seen really needs to be open, honest, and forthright. Again, reflecting the values. You can see this as a theme of our webinar. And really talk about the lessons you're learning. No one has the playbook for this. We're all getting through this day by day and figuring out the right ways to do things. So you need to be clear of what we've learned, and then be able to pivot and really change how your organization operates. So this notion of shared values and beliefs are really important. Articulating those, having a good commitment to those values, they can really bring your organizations together and really help connect your donors. So lots of things going forward when you think about decisions to come, volunteer recruitment that I mentioned, financial policies, fundraising, donor engagement, and advocacy. Advocacy is going to be a big one. So I'm just going to take a drink. Particularly in this era where we've seen federal government come out with many policies to help around payroll, which our national nonprofit organizations have been behind to do some of that advocacy, but we need to also see that in the state and local levels as well. You're advocating not just for your organization, but you're also advocating for the people who have been most affected by this pandemic, which is definitely skewed towards minority and low income populations. We've seen this, you've probably seen some of this data that's coming out. Where we have data, and we don't have complete data, but where we have data, we see exponential growth affecting those minority populations much more than their actual populations, like African Americans in particular. In the state of Illinois, it's almost triple. Chicago, it's over double the death rates. So overall, we have a lot of work to do to address this. Otto mentioned board assessment. We always try to push people towards Board Source. They have a paid assessment product and some free versions, but if reach out to any of us, we probably have our own smaller assessment version, and I'm happy to share that as well. Again, as I mentioned, advocacy. You can do advocacy. I would encourage you to do research, look at who you're serving, gather information, thinking about how this pandemic is affecting your community, write different things, get engaged in policy work and advocacy work. You are absolutely allowed to do advocacy as nonprofit organizations, as 501c3s. There are very few restrictions to that, but boards have to be more comfortable with you doing some of that work. At the very least, you can be an ally to people who are associated with your cause or purpose. Secondly, you can certainly advocate publicly around a policy or particular cause issue. And then activists puts you into that campaign to bring about political or social change. So you can create a supportive environment, assign staff and board to help you with that, make rules around that so people know what they're allowed to do, and try to preserve time for that, join coalitions, which many of you have already joined, and really start advocacy at your local level. You should be engaging with your local elected officials, your local leaders, so that they know what effect this pandemic is having on the people that you serve. Ways to engage that we've seen right now, certainly around Census 2020. So if you're a nonprofit and serve a population that's very hard to reach, then you know that you should be engaging that population with the census. It's really important that everyone gets counted. In Illinois, I think we're up to close to 70% participation rates. But people are worried if we don't get to that 100% and we don't count people. And the other way is we have an election coming up. So try to support Get Out the Vote. We have Get Out the Vote drives by nonprofit organizations, again, to engage in that role of advocacy. Now I'm going to be stuck. There we go. So really takeaways: assess where you're at, know your strengths and weaknesses, ask those hard questions, set financial goals and policies, build a culture of philanthropy, engage your stakeholders in your story, combining that with your data. Yes, plan so that you have some measurable goals, and innovate, even think about what's possible for your organization. There's a couple of resources I would recommend. Transformational Governance is a book that was written a couple of years ago by some researchers working for the Association of Associations. They did a lot of study, but it really is relevant to what we're talking about today. How can we really transform organizations and how we do that? All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing slides, and we're gonna go into a Q&A session so that we can really dig into some of the questions that you might be thinking about. And if you have a camera, you can turn it on so we can see you. That'd be great. All the presenters, if they can turn on their mics and cameras so that any of us can respond to that, that would be great. And let's see, I will open the chat just to see if I missed anybody. I think there was an earlier question for you, Otto, around when you talk about generative work, is this something that should be done both at a board meeting level, or is it also something that could be done kind of in task forces or committees to really dig into an issue, or both? What have you seen really work?
Sure. This is always to be done by the full board, because, I mean, first of all, they're going to come up with great ideas, and this is really what it's about, but you want to engage them in meaningful ways other than just showing up to meetings and listening to reports. Now, task forces can be helpful once you start to identify, say you go through a generative process and come up with 3 ideas. I would get task forces, maybe take that to the next step, but report back to the board. But I never want a board to delegate generative thinking to anybody. And it doesn't need to be, it can be a 10-minute exercise at a board meeting, where they, have a standard thing that comes up and just say, hey, let's take a step back, and what if we did this? Let's talk about that. It just creates a different culture.
Thank you. So Paula asked about putting financials up on your website and said that there were some scamming, potential scamming information, and that people were able to get board members' names and things like that. I mean, I think if people are looking for your board members' names, hopefully they can find them on your organization's website, that those things are listed there anyway. Ideally, also, if you're going to put your board members, I would like a picture, a bio, and contact information. I think just a name doesn't tell me enough. I've had students go out and research boards, and I'll ask them, like, well, who are their board members? And they're like, well, there's 5 people listed, but I don't know anything about them. And there wasn't an email to contact them to talk to them. So again, it's that appearance of transparency and accountability. If you really want to be open and honest, then allow us to contact these folks. And I know that it's risk, right? There's a risk aversion there. Just like not publishing staff emails on a website, and there's one, it says info, or there's a form. And I know that that's risky, because then everybody could be emailing you. But what it does do is like, well, where is this going to go, this info at, and there's 700 employees. Like, do I really trust it's going to get over there? So yeah, it does come with risk. I know that this is no risk. But at the same time, I think there's much more gains to be had than the risk involved. That's my personal opinion. But I don't know, Pam or Otto or Juliette, if you want to chime in on that.
I agree.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I swear I didn't talk to them before.
We're with you.
I put the name of the book because I ran through that kind of quick. So I did put the name of the book in there, Transformational Governance. I think it's a good one. It's from Wiley and from that association. I'll never get the full name of that association. You can also get it from there. ASAE.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Alicia, will we be sharing the deck with the participants?
Yes, I'm going to convert it to a PDF, and Otto has his separate, so he's going to also share that with me. We'll send that out. I want to, before we go, I also wanted to give you some other kind of resources. If you haven't signed up for National Council of Nonprofits, their listserv, do that, because anything that comes out in terms of legislation, either the state or national level, I usually get it's got to be weekly, but it might be more updates on that. Anything that's happening in the nonprofit sector, those are the folks that I turn to on a national basis. And then your state association, which is Forefront. Interestingly, yesterday, Joan Gary in her podcast, Nonprofits Are Messy, she released an episode in the top 20 attributes of an outstanding board. I'm like, there's got to be somebody intervening. So if you want to check out her podcast, if you're already not on that. If you're interested in anything to do with nonprofit finance, some of the financial ratios that I mentioned and others, you can definitely go to Nonprofit Finance Fund. And then Independent Sector is another kind of ally organization for the sector. So in terms of resources, those are just things to keep in mind. So there will be, we will circulate the decks to you. I have to figure out how to do it, but you will get a link to a recording. And then you'll get a link to an online evaluation from Civic Leadership Academy at CGS in an email. And then if you haven't already, you can get CEU or CPE credit for the webinar series. Janice is your contact there. And we do have a bunch of upcoming webinars as well. So those are, I want to make sure I got in the reminders, but we are happy to take more questions. Other thoughts? Any challenges that you're seeing in your nonprofit organizations when it comes to the boards that you just want to pick our brains about? Because that's fun too. Trish, go ahead.
Great, thanks. My name is Trish Glaze. I am the president of the Dundee Township Foundation, along with the government entity, Dundee Township Supervisor. One of the things, the foundation is just about 6, maybe 7 months old. It hit just in time for COVID, let me tell you that. But our board, one of the concerns of our board members, and we're seeing this a little bit more, is that we did a whole social media, a Twitter, Facebook, and we listed the board members, and 2 of our board members' identities, I guess I'm going to use the word, have been hacked, associated with Facebook. Does anybody have any? I mean, I've taken everybody's names off, you know, relatively, but is there any security features that can be employed by nonprofits to protect them?
So when you say you did a Facebook campaign, you identified them on Facebook, like here's our board members and their names
Right.
were listed?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. I mean, you can have private profiles on Facebook unless you're a friend, they can't see anything. So I wouldn't put, like if I'm posting on Facebook, I don't link it to my personal account. I may just have my name listed on it. So I'm right now president of our library foundation. When I'm on the library foundation, my name is listed, but it doesn't link to my personal profile.
Okay.
So you can separate those 2 identities, I guess is what I'm saying. That's fairly easy to do. And then your personal profile, you can keep that relatively private, that only friends can see pictures and posts.
Okay.
But you know, we're in this new era of you can't really hide. Right? So you guys, it would take my undergrads about 5 minutes to get my home address. No, not 5 minutes, 5 seconds to get my home address. About probably 5 minutes to get what I pay in taxes. Probably another 2 or 3 minutes to know what schools my kids attend. I mean, it wouldn't take long for them to find all that stuff. So if you want to find me, you can find me. So there is definitely a level of risk because of the world we're in. We are very public. And this, I know this makes people very nervous. We can put up certain barriers between things, but if you're going to try to be, if you're an individual who's looking to cause problems, you just go around them and you find a way to cause problems. So that's my personal way to, you can do the best you can, and the rest you probably can't do too much, but I don't know what other folks think. Anyone else have a thought or a question? How are things going in your organization? All of you are here. You spent the morning with us, most of you. Do you think the dust is settling, that you found new ways to do things and new innovations, or are you still in crisis? Like today is a new thing and I've got to react to that thing. Yeah, Kate, you were shaking your head, so you want to chime in? What's your crisis of the day?
Right. Well, I've been on this for 3 hours, so God only knows when I go back. Right?
Don't look at your email. I know.
Right. I know. Right. No, I think it's a little bit of both for us, at least. I work for a nonprofit. We serve children who have hearing loss. So we have a school and education component. So like most schools like this, everything has gone virtual and is now online. And so the staff learning that and the staff switching over to that, like that initial shock factor's done. Not done, but we, like you say, kind of eased a bit. But there's this like hanging fear of like, okay, but what about when we do go back? Will we go back? When will we go back? What will happen then? How will funders respond? Because we're starting to hear some of that fundraising impact. My role is as a fundraiser. You know, some grantors are holding off till fourth quarter because we're not basic needs. So we're already, so it's a lot of like,
unknown.
Is the shoe going to drop? How scary is it? Are we really worried? How bad is this going to get? And so there's a lot of trying to do the work so that things are in place. And we've had quite a bit of transition with new leadership on our board just in the last month, which is great and exciting, but also kind of scary. So there's just a lot of the uncertainty is very hard, and that prolonged adrenaline can only last you so long before it starts to hurt you. And that's, I think, kind of where we're at.
I know everybody is used to seeing all the graphs, like the peak and when is the peak and that. So I think we're all feeling it emotionally too. Like, is this my peak? Is this the plateau? Is there going to be a new peak? The unknown, I think, is definitely stressful. That's why I mentioned on the mental health organizations doing what they can to address it. We're not going to have the same employees coming back. We might not even all come back together physically. So how many more? I mean, Kate, you're in fundraising. How many days now do you really think you need to be in the office coming out of this?
Absolutely.
It's probably not 5.
Absolutely. That's a conversation. And so much of the fundraising, marketing, outreach piece of my role deals with going to networking events, going to large groups, presenting to clubs, and is that even going to happen anymore? How will that look virtually? So there's a lot of that. Special events is so up in the air. So totally, to your point, agree.
Yeah.
And then you think about attendance fatigue, right? You think about, is everyone going to push their events back to whenever, the fall or the winter, and everyone can't attend every event. And if there's going to be this fatigue, and how do we begin to change the look of that? There's some conversation about, I think you mentioned it, Alicia, too, that these giving events might replace if people pool together, right? Now in Rockford, what we've done is we've created a pool of funders that have come together. We're calling ourselves the 815 Community Response Team. And the idea is, how can we create a pool of dollars so that under the philosophy that pooling is going to be easy, is going to be a better approach than individual organizations out competing with one another, but also encouraging funders to be flexible in the way they fund. So not necessarily new programs, but existing programs, and providing operational support. And for some of those grant makers to look at, how do you extend deadlines on reporting on existing grants? And then how do you look at grants that will focus on recovery? And that's operational sustainability and building resilience. So we have a large number of funders who've come together and are fitting with under that philosophy, and then working to create a pool of funds for the recovery specifically. Because
We've seen a lot of cooperation on the funder side. It's been great to see.
Yeah. Not everyone, but but many, right? Yeah. Because what we're hearing from organizations, not my programs can cover themselves if I can get moving forward, but what I need is absolute operational support. I need operational dollars to sustain my organization. So we're trying to be responsive.
So this is a question probably for more of the folks that are on the coming from nonprofits, but also other presenters. I've seen different responses to this. We lost our spring fundraiser. We lost out on a big grant. We've had to shut down programs. And that's the message they go out to the community with. Like, woe is me. You got to save us. We're going to sink. Like, you need to, all of that stuff, which is a highly emotional, highly charged appeal. And I've looked at their financials. They have the ability to go 6 months without any new infusion of cash. And that's, I think one of you said, I think it was you, Pam, looking at like greed, right? Where does that factor into this? Like, shouldn't they be drawing down from their own reserves? What I've told them, and lots of people told them, that's why they're there. It's not a perpetual cash reserve. It's meant to be savings that you use and build up in good and bad economic times. And yet those are the organizations that are going out there like, we have to do this right now, make sure you send in. And I'm like, what are they doing? It kind of goes back to also what Ottawa, you're saying around values. Like, I just think that's dishonest, because nobody's going to go, like some of us are going to go and look at their financial record and go, wait a second, like, you don't need the money right now. These organizations are actually still delivering programs and services, and you actually have a lot of cash on hand. So I think there's some moral stuff going on in there that's really bothering me for some organizations.
I'm with you, Alicia. It's a lot about integrity, but it's a lot about public trust. I mean, I've said it a couple of times. We rely on the public's trust to sustain our organization, and to taint your reputation if someone says, well, wait a minute, don't they have this huge foundation that funnels money for the organization for this very purpose? It can impact your organization long term, the respect of the community.
So something I would like to say in response to Kate's comment is, we often talk about who owns your organization. And, at the end of the day, it's the executive director. He or she is the one who goes to bed at night and can't sleep because of whatever the situation is. And, listening to Kate, I think it's incumbent on boards that they need to know how their executive director is doing, and they really need to step up in new roles today and say, hey, you're not going to do this alone. We're going to share this with you. We're going to figure this out. We're going to make these decisions. But I think the pressure right now on executive directors and executive staff is just unimaginable. And I would just like to see boards say, if we do anything, we need to make sure we're in this together and let our executive director know that we've got his or her back.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think I mentioned it at the end of my presentation. Fundraising is resilient. It will return. It might take some time, but people will start giving again. But painting the doom and gloom picture, I mean, it's a real balance, isn't it? With, I need to be honest and transparent about our real situation, but making sure that what you're presenting is true and accurate information.
Yeah, in one hand, what Alicia said is right. Too many times we go out poor handing it that, oh my God, please save us. But I think more often than not, fundraisers go out and paint too rosy of a picture where everything is fine and all of our programs are successful, and we don't leave any room for the donor to come in and make a difference. And I think that's just something we need to be mindful of, is that balance. And certainly to be open and say, we've got challenges, but we're all in this together. We're going to figure it out because we know who we are. But you've got to leave room for the donor too to come in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Alicia, you mentioned, maybe could emphasize that a little bit about the recession and how very few organizations actually close their doors.
Yep. Very few, like less than 10 in the state. And everybody was like, oh my God, if this goes on much longer, lots of closures. We didn't see it. Now, we did see mergers, but really mergers tend to happen. What we've seen through research is mergers tend to happen with a strong organization, and it extends some kind of geographic reach, like a hospital system. Those are when mergers become possible. Mergers don't happen when some, weak sister says, hey, we really need help. We're looking for a partner. No one is going to partner or merge with an organization that's less than they are. They need to be fairly strong, both of them, in order for a merger and acquisition to happen. And that usually is at the board level. Where I've seen mergers and acquisitions, it's a board president saying, do we really think this is a good fit? And how do we protect our identities? And how do we inform our history? Do we lose our name? But those have to be generally very like organizations in terms of their financial health. Mergers and acquisitions don't happen with weak partners. They're like, I'm not going to take on your debt. Like you're just going to wither and go away over time. But we didn't see a lot of closures either, just straight up terminations. Because organizations really can exist on life support for a very, very long time. They just slowly wither, but they generally don't die overall in the big picture. They just shrink and become obsolete over time, but they generally don't go away. Yeah, Kate, you had a thought?
I have a question. You guys are referencing this issue. It's a separate topic, so if you want to stay on this, I'll shut up. But I'm hearing a lot of people try and compare what's going on now to different tragedies and issues that have happened in our past. 9/11, the financial crisis in the 80s, the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. I'd love to hear the expertise thoughts on doing that, because I'm struggling with that, because I think this doesn't look like any of those. This is so sustained, long-term. We have no idea what 6 months into this, a year into this truly will look like. The most comparable things probably 1918, when fundraising today was completely different. So I'd love some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd love to show you the book, but it hasn't been written. There's no playbook, right? We can reference things to say we think it's going to go this way, like the state budget crisis, but that took 2 years of long extensions. We didn't drop off a cliff within a week. So, you know, that's the struggle, is we haven't been here before. And that's why, and Otto, you know, feel free to chime in. This is why this work is so important to do, because we don't have a playbook. Go ahead, Otto, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm old enough. I've lived through and worked through probably in the late 1970s, 80s, the oil crisis, the Jimmy Carter years, hyperinflation, the market crash of 87, 9/11, 2008. Today is different because it's almost like the carpet has been pulled out from under us. The social fabric here has been ripped to shreds. And the resources we have to work with, some of them are gone. So we don't know. We need to come out of this strong, but we're not sure how that's going to happen, which is why I think having the sense of asking questions is okay, not knowing is okay, but we need to work together, and means not just in the boardroom, but outside. And we need to figure this out. But Kate, you bring up a great point. We don't know, and no individual knows, but we're going to figure this out collectively. But you know, one thing I agree with Pam is that this is going to come back, because the work that is done in the nonprofit sector is the most important work that's being done today. There's just no doubt about that.
Yeah, and I also think the other thing that's different with this one is this is all impacting the globe at the same time.
True.
So what's happening here is happening in Italy and happening in Africa and happening in Australia. There's been rolling economic crises before, but this one, that it's global in scale, we just haven't seen that before. And it's really highlighting all of the inequities in our communities that we've talked about and have really not done a lot about. So are we going to be more informed coming out of this? Are we going to address those inequities, or just continue to serve those populations? Because we use those service words all the time. Or are we actually going to try to change their economic condition? Those are questions I want boards to ask. It's not about serving low-income communities anymore. We have to say why this is still happening. What are we doing to change their condition, not just serving them? But I don't know if we'll get to have those good discussions, particularly in an election year. Or maybe we will. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the worst organization, maybe not, well, I would hate to see organizations coming out of this being exactly the same. Just, you know, doing what they did before, but which means they sat on everything they had and just rode out the storm while people around them suffered and died. And so hopefully we're going to come out of this leaner, meaner, and better sense of who we are. And our donors too. I hope our donors are getting a wake-up call. And one thing I've enjoyed about this is seeing people come to the realization that technology and social media is not the savior. You know, we're all missing that human interaction, that sense of genuine relationship. And I hope that awakens the best in each of us.
I've never liked my mailman more. I hear the tires and I'm like, oh, he's coming. You know, there's a human that's coming by my house. And I wave to him and I talk to him every day, because it's the only person I see outside of my regular human family that's in my house. That's different. You know, my neighbors, we wave, but like, oh, you're the contact to the outside world. You bring me my Amazon. God bless you. Yeah, so true. Well, I know we're just about 12 o'clock, so we're happy to close out unless there are folks who want to stay on and chit chat for a little while. I definitely want to thank all of you for coming. We've enjoyed it. Any final words from our panelists?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much,
Thank you all
everybody.
for being with us.
Thank you. So we can sign off. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye now.
Bye.
Take care of yourselves.
Time for lunch, right?
My stomach's growling. I don't know if you could hear it.
No, I only grabbed a banana this morning, so I'm definitely going to have some lunch. It's fun living with like 7 other people because there's constantly like food smells, which is problematic. And I smell nachos at 11:30 at night, and I smell waffles at noon, like just weird.
I saw a Facebook page the other day that said, Facebook post that said, "Am I getting tan but from the light of my refrigerator?"